Chapter 5. Starting to answer the first question. In Book 4, Socrates answers the Republic's first question, what is justice? Keeping to the plan devised in Book 2, he first tells us what political justice in the polis or city-state is, and then, arguing that the ideal polis and the human soul, sush, share the same three-part structure, he applies his definition of political justice to the psyche, arriving at his definition of personal justice. His definition is interesting in many ways, not least of which is its accounting for justice not as a matter of outward behavior, as Cephalus and Polemarchus' definitions did, but rather as an inward matter of psychic harmony. Happiness, parts and wholes, individuals and communities. Book 4 begins with Adeimantus jumping back into the conversation with a concern that brings to the fore the tension between individualism and communitarianism. He worries that the guardians and auxiliaries will not be especially happy, given the lifestyles Socrates described at the close of Book 3, communal living, no privacy, not much money, etc. The city really belongs to them, Adeimantus says, yet they derive no good from it since they lack the things that are thought to belong to people who are blessedly happy. This is certainly a plausible view about what the best kind of life is like. The Greek verb translated as thought is nu omicron musete epsilon tau alpha iota, nomozitai, which is cognate with nu mu omicron, nomos, custom or law, and thus indicates what is thought or deemed or customarily taken to be the best life, not necessarily what actually is the best life. Plato has Socrates give a twofold response to Adeimantus. First, he suggests that far from being unhappy, the guardians may well be the happiest group in the ideal polis. They are performing the task or function for which they are best suited, after all, and if they are performing it well, they are probably delighting in it. It is another reminder that while the good of the community is Socrates' primary concern, it is not his only concern. Socrates then reminds Adeimantus of the plan they have adopted, to investigate the nature of personal justice and its connection to personal happiness by discovering the nature of political justice and its connection to happiness. His focus, then, is on political happiness, on making the whole city happy. He does not aim to make any one group outstandingly happy, but to make the whole city so. Even though he seems to be doubling down on the holistic or communitarian ethos that is regularly contrasted with the individualism which many readers will find intuitively more attractive, his communitarianism here is largely methodological, a useful device to get to his ultimate concern, which is individual happiness. In Book 5, he will suggest that individual well-being depends in no small way on whether the polis one lives in is just, which suggests a more modest community-first ethos than he has been espousing heretofore. The ideal city, finishing touches. After giving a warning about the damage economic inequality can wreak in a city, a theme to which he will return in Book 8, Socrates reminds Adeimantus of the importance of the guardians preserving the educational system as they have received it, lest it be corrupted by seemingly minor and innocuous changes. Many readers will have witnessed versions of such cultural conservatism in their lifetimes, for example, panicked responses to the threats posed by jazz, Elvis, the Beatles, and rap music. But lest Plato seem like just another cranky old fuddy-duddy bemoaning music he did not grow up with, we should remember that the ideal city's music was chosen intentionally and with great care, since it is meant to cultivate traits of character necessary to the city's thriving. The worry is that lawlessness easily creeps in, unnoticed, so, given how malleable young people are, a fact of human nature that is highly relevant to the educational system developed in Books 2 and 3, it is important that music and culture generally provide sustenance to young souls. Children will absorb lawfulness or lawlessness. Plato mentions no neutral third option from the games they play and the songs they sing and hear, so it is vital that the healthy system be preserved. Changes of mode and meter can seem trivial and morally neutral, but they are not, on Plato's moral aesthetic conception of character development. Even if we do not share Plato's worry that changing to a new form of music threatens the whole system, keeping in mind his beliefs in the malleability of young minds and the inseparability of morality and aesthetics should render his worry at least less curmudgeonly. Though there are several other things worth discussing in this part of Book 4, I will mention just one, what we might call Plato's legislative minimalism. It is foolish, Socrates says, to think that legislation can overcome failures of education. Though some of his examples are trivial, regulating hairstyles and clothes, others are not, how the young treat the old and how they care for their parents, for example. This brief stretch of the Republic might seem little more than harumphing about kids today, but Plato is doing more than mere griping here. He might not agree with the details of Ed Tom's diagnosis in Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men. It starts when you begin to overlook bad manners. Any time you quit herein, sir, and ma'am, the end is pretty much in sight. I told her, I said, it reaches into ever straighter one, but in principle they seem to be of one mind. Communities are held together by more than rules and laws, they are held together by shared values and affections. Education in Plato's broad sense is primarily character education, after all, and there is something to his point that legislation cannot repair defective character education. Still, we might worry that his view ignores the expressive function of law, the law's power to say something about the shared norms and values that bind a community together. If, in addition to governing behavior, the law can also shape attitudes and beliefs, then it may have a contribution to make to character education, if only an ancillary one. In my home state of Wisconsin, adultery is a crime, a felony, in fact. Prosecutions are extremely rare. There have been none in the last 30 years, but presumably that is not because there have been so few violations of Wisconsin statute. I know of no empirical studies of this law's efficacy in reducing adultery, but it seems unlikely that potential adulterers would be deterred by it, especially given its non-enforcement. But even if there is no direct causal link between criminalizing adultery and reducing extramarital adventuring, its criminalization may yet serve an important function, expressing the citizenry's collective disapproval of adultery. If the law plays this expressive role, striking the adultery statute from the books might seem to signal, if not the community's approval of adultery, at least its non-disapproval, and it is not implausible that this would have negative behavioral consequences by changing attitudes and feelings about the importance of marital fidelity, promise-keeping, etc. So there may be a dimension to the law that Plato is missing here. On the other hand, a law's remaining on the books because of its expressive function might cultivate the sort of cynicism and hypocrisy Adiamantus complains about in Book 2. Many citizens make a great show of the importance of the values just mentioned, because it is important to seem just, but in practice their conduct suggests a preference for being unjust. The political virtues. Now that the ideal city is complete, it is time to look for justice in it. But before we do that, I bring up a seemingly minor point that, as is so often the case with Plato, is surprisingly deep upon examination, carrying more philosophical weight than initial appearances suggest. In announcing the completion of the ideal city, which paves the way for the inquiry into the nature of justice, Socrates says to Adiamantus, "Your city might now be said to be established." This seems innocuous enough, but up to this point, Socrates' possessive pronoun of choice has been the first-person plural. He speaks of our city and our citizens. At the corresponding point in Book 2, at the completion of the first city, Socrates says, "Well, Adiamantus, has our city grown to completeness, then? Why the shift here from our city to your city?" Perhaps it is merely stylistic variation on Plato's part. After all, within just a few lines Socrates shifts back to our city, and then it is soon back again to your city. I suspect that the shift in pronouns is Plato's way of reminding us that Socrates, despite being the chief theoretical architect of the just completed ideal city, still regards the first city, the rustic utopia rejected by Glaucon as a city for pigs, as the true city, the healthy one. Perhaps Plato hopes his readers will pick up on Socrates' ambivalence and reflect further on his allegiance to his rustic utopia. That city, which has been all but forgotten by this point in the Republic, was without guardians and auxiliaries and indeed without classes of any kind. The just completed city is not only structured by political classes but in fact, we will soon see, has the same structure as the human soul. This is a perfect place to remind attentive readers of the second-best nature of the ideal city, if only to make us think through how seriously to take Socrates' attitude toward it. So what seems a matter of mere style may turn out to be really a matter of substance, though we will not pursue so fine a point any further. Hopefully, though, this brief discussion reminds us of what a subtle work the Republic is and why it rewards repeated rereading. Cardinal virtues. If the city is well-founded, Socrates argues, it will be completely good and thus it will not be missing any of the moral virtues. For Socrates and Plato, there are four primary virtues: courage, moderation, wisdom, and justice. Aristotle had a much longer list, including friendliness, wit, generosity, and proper pride, among others. Philosophers often speak of Plato's four virtues as the cardinal virtues, which suggests at a minimum that the virtues are important or paramount. But in another, stronger sense, to call a virtue a cardinal virtue is to say that it is theoretically basic. There are no virtues more basic than it, and any non-cardinal virtue is somehow reducible to or a version of the cardinal virtue in question. Socrates says that there are four virtues and that together they make the city completely good, which suggests that these virtues are cardinal in the stronger, theoretically basic sense. To see what is at stake here, consider the attention paid earlier in the Republic to cultivating the virtue of piety by regulating stories about the gods, and consider Plato's having devoted an entire dialogue, the Euthyphro, to investigating the nature of piety. If piety is not a cardinal virtue, perhaps it can be subsumed under justice, since piety concerns what is owed to the gods and justice is plausibly thought of as giving to each what they are owed. Viewing piety as a requirement or form of justice would preserve the cardinality of Socrates' four virtues. One problem with this view, however, is that in Book 1 Socrates casts doubt on defining justice in terms of what is owed, and we will soon see that the definition of justice Socrates proposes is not couched in terms of giving to each what they are owed. Another, related, worry is that what goes for piety can also go for the other virtues. If courage, for example, can be thought of as what soldiers owe the city, then like piety, courage is not itself a distinct virtue but instead a kind of justice. So by seeking to preserve the cardinality of the four cardinal virtues, we end up destroying their cardinality. This concern about piety is in a sense internal to Plato's moral thinking and to the account of virtue he is offering here. He seems committed to piety's being a genuine, standalone virtue, and yet he excludes it from his official list. A different kind of concern is external. When looking at Plato's list, we might think he is excluding some traits we take to be virtues. Many readers will think of kindness and generosity, for example, as virtues of character, and thus think Plato's list is mistaken not because of an internal inconsistency or tension but because it fails to include traits that belong on the list. When thinking about the attitude Socrates expresses toward the disabled in Book 3, many readers will think that the virtue of compassion is in short supply in his ideal city. It would be difficult to subsume generosity under justice, since generosity is at least in part a matter of giving which goes beyond what is owed. Yet another worry concerns the argument Socrates gives for the complete goodness of the ideal city. P1. If our city has been correctly founded, it is completely good. P2. Our city has been correctly founded. C. Therefore, our city is completely good. While we might question why correctness must imply completeness, P1 seems plausible. But many readers, noting the absence of individual liberty and equal political rights in the ideal city, will have grave doubts about P2. Socrates' more community-minded interlocutors raise no such objections, but as thoughtful readers we will want to engage in philosophical dialogue with our author by thinking through the issues for ourselves, in both senses of for ourselves. We want to think about these issues independently, not merely relying on what Plato or Socrates or whoever has to say. And we want to think about what Socrates' claims mean to us. As he reminds his readers at various points, Socrates' method depends upon his interlocutors saying what they really think. Good philosophical reading often requires adopting another's point of view, examining whether the claims an author makes from within that point of view are consistent with it. But good philosophical reading also requires scrutinizing that point of view itself, not just for its internal consistency but also for its substantive correctness. Of course, there is a danger here of taking our own points of view as sacrosanct and beyond criticism and rejecting points of view at odds with them. But one of the values of reading a book like The Republic, which expresses perspectives very different from our own, is that they can prod us to think through our deeply held but not always carefully, critically scrutinized beliefs. As usual, there is more to be said here, and by no means am I suggesting that Plato has no plausible responses to these worries. But in questioning the adequacy of his claim about how many virtues there are, we honor him by doing the thing he most wants of us, to think philosophically and critically. Wisdom. The first virtue discovered in the city, wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, Sophia, is the virtue of a particular class, the guardian rulers. Wisdom is often thought of as an intellectual virtue rather than a character virtue, as it is a kind of knowledge. Aristotle distinguished the intellectual and character virtues, although he ultimately thought that some of them were mutually dependent. While this is not a distinction Plato explicitly makes, it is a helpful one, both in itself and for the light it will shed in Book 7 of the Republic, when Plato is busy distinguishing philosophers from non-philosophers. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge, Socrates thinks, but not just any old kind of knowledge, and certainly not the kind of knowledge that craftspeople possess. Nor is it the kind of abstract, theoretical knowledge a mathematician might possess. It is more general than the craftsperson's know-how and more practical than the mathematician's know that. It is knowledge of what is best for the city as a whole. Although many readers are leery of Socrates' holism and communitarianism, here they seem unproblematic. Wisdom is knowledge of what is best for the city as a whole, not what is best for any particular group of citizens. If the city is to function well, it must be unified, and it can only be unified if its rulers aim at the good of the whole, rather than at what is good for a particular part of it at the expense of the whole. Socrates has already implied that good rulers will strive to minimize economic inequality, given its disintegrating effects. Some economic inequality is to be expected and may well be beneficial, but too much leads to there not being a city. But two cities at war with one another, that of the poor and that of the rich. Just as the ideal city's founders aimed not to make any one group outstandingly happy but to make the whole so, as far as possible, its rulers must aim at the good of the city as a whole. It should make sense that this is the virtue distinctive of the guardians, if we remember the earlier account of a virtue as what enables its possessor to perform its function well. Since the function of the rulers is unsurprisingly to rule, they can rule well only if they possess wisdom. A ruler who makes only lucky guesses, or even educated guesses, about what is best for the city is less likely to rule well than a ruler who knows what is best for the city. Now, of course, we can agree that rulers require wisdom to rule well without agreeing with Socrates' conception of it or with his belief that only a few citizens are capable of it. One might be skeptical that knowledge about what is best for a city, state, or country is really possible, settling instead for experience-grounded beliefs. And one might think wisdom is at least in principle within the grasp of ordinary citizens. We have already seen, and will see in more detail in Books 8 and 9, that Socrates is no fan of democracy, presumably because he is skeptical that ordinary citizens are capable of the sort of knowledge needed to rule well. Courage. Courage, like wisdom, is also a virtue distinctive of a particular class, the soldiering auxiliaries. It becomes clear that the guardians, who emerge from the auxiliaries, will also possess courage, but their distinctive, rather than sole, virtue is wisdom, not courage. As above, their possessing courage makes sense when we remember that the auxiliaries' function is to protect the city, which they can do well only if they possess courage. A surprising way in which courage is similar to wisdom is that courage, at least as Socrates characterizes it, is at root a cognitive affair. It is power to preserve through everything the correct and law-inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what is not. Attentive readers will have noticed that the wisdom the guardians possess is a kind of knowledge, but the auxiliaries' courage is a matter of belief, not knowledge. Making clear how knowledge and belief differ will be a central focus of Books V, 6, and 7. It might be helpful to bring the JTB, justified true belief, conception of knowledge into play again, reminding ourselves that it is not Plato's view but rather a heuristic to help us make sense of some features of the Republic. The auxiliaries believe that certain things are worse than death, slavery, and dishonor, for example, but the guardians know why these things are worse than death. They have, in addition to a true belief, a justification for their true belief. While the auxiliaries' beliefs lack the intellectual backing the guardians possess, this in no way prevents their holding it firmly and unshakably. Their belief that there are fates worse than death must be dyed in the wool, in Socrates' memorable metaphor, dyed in so deeply that the color is fast no amount of washing, can remove it, for 429b. If the Spartan soldiers holding the pass at Thermopylae against Persian invaders, an event that, until the film The 300, was the province of classicists and history nerds, valued their own lives over the good of the community, they would have thrown down their weapons and run for safety. The opening pages of Book 3, attentive readers will remember, were rife with constraints on stories and poetry designed to cultivate courage. Any would-be auxiliary who believes that their death would be the worst thing that could happen believes a true falsehood, a belief that is radically false and distorts an important dimension of reality. The auxiliary's education, both poetic and physical, is meant to cultivate the virtue of courage. We should note a subtle but important refinement Socrates makes to his definition of courage. He first describes courage as the auxiliary's power to preserve through everything its belief about what things are to be feared, but he quickly adds a qualifier: courage is preservation of the belief that has been inculcated by the law through education about what things and sorts of things are to be feared, a qualification he repeats a page later, the correct and law-inculcated belief. He is making a distinction between what Aristotle will later call natural virtue and virtue proper. Some people and indeed many animals seem by nature courageous, born with correct beliefs about what is properly feared and with the power to preserve those beliefs in the face of danger. But unless these beliefs are the product of education, what is present is not courage, but something else. Socrates does not elaborate, but presumably he thinks this because proper courage's natural analog may misfire without the guidance of reason and education. We have already seen that too much physical education and not enough musical education results in a person's becoming hard and harsh rather than courageous. Moderation. Unlike courage and wisdom, moderation is not distinctive of any particular class in the city. Instead, moderation spreads throughout the whole. Socrates starts with the common-sense connection between moderation, also called temperance, and self-control. If you decline, and I insist on a third slice of cheesecake, you seem to have and I seem to lack the virtue of moderation. But explaining this in terms of self-control is puzzling, Socrates thinks, since what does the controlling and what is controlled is the very same thing. The puzzle is solved when we realize that our souls have better and worse parts, with the better part comprising our capacities for reason and choice, and the worse part our appetite and desires. In the self-controlled person, the naturally better part is in control of the naturally worse, so they decline that third slice of cheesecake while I do not. There is something problematic about Socrates' procedure here. The plan is to figure out the nature of the political virtues in order to discover the nature of the personal virtues. But here he is appealing to the structure of the soul or person in trying to understand the nature of the political virtue of moderation, so he is building into the polis the psychic structure he will soon claim to find there. As a grad school professor once wrote in the margins of a paper of mine, if you are going to try to pull the rabbit out of the hat, it is best if you are not seen putting it in. But perhaps there is no big problem here. After all, Socrates is simply appealing to an ordinary belief about moderation as a kind of self-control. He is not importing any high-level psychological theory, and he may well have been able to arrive at his conclusion that something in which the better rules the worse is properly called moderate and self-controlled without the appeal to common-sense psychology. The ideal polis is self-controlled and thus moderate, Socrates thinks, because it is ruled by the guardians, who are the best part of the polis. But there is more to it than that. A city in which the guardians only tenuously hold power over the rebellious craftspeople is not moderate, nor would Socrates think it is, for it is lacking the harmony distinctive of true self-control. In a moderate or self-controlled polis, the three classes all sing the same song together. There is agreement between the naturally worse and the naturally better as to which of the two is to rule. As with the wisdom and courage, Socrates plays up the cognitive nature of this virtue. Ruler and ruled, share the same belief about who should rule. They are in agreement, not in the way in which a good drawing or measurement agrees with its object or in the way in which some food agrees with my finicky stomach but other food does not, but in the way that only rational creatures can be, consent. We should tread carefully here, however, for the idea of consent can be misleading. Socrates is not offering the modern, liberal view that the legitimacy of a government turns on the consent of the governed. The consent Socrates has in mind is a symptom of good government, not a condition of its legitimacy. Presumably, in a well-governed city, the craftspeople consent to being governed by the guardians because things are going well for them economically, they are happy with the arrangement and are happy to be left alone to their cobbling, baking, doctoring, etc., and their family lives. The entitlement of the guardians to rule depends not on the consent of those they govern but on their possessing the relevant virtue, wisdom. A word or two about the spread-out nature of moderation is in order. Unlike wisdom and courage, which are what we might call particular virtues, which are virtues distinctive of particular classes, moderation is a holistic virtue, a virtue of the whole city, not of any of its particular classes. This is a subtle point, easily misunderstood. Although a city is wise because its rulers are wise and brave because its auxiliaries are brave, Plato is not saying that the city is moderate because every class is moderate. Moderation does not work that way. By way of analogy, think of a basket containing red balls, green balls, and yellow balls. The collection of balls has a property which none of its members has, the property of being multicolored. The collection is multicolored because of the colors of the individual balls. If the basket contained only green balls, the collection would not exhibit the property of being multicolored. But none of the individual balls in the basket is multicolored, each is either red or green or yellow. Of course, nothing prevents individual balls from being multicolored. A particular ball might be red, green, and yellow, but none of the balls in our example has this property. So the collections having this property depends upon the members having certain properties, but it is the collection, and not its members, that has the property of being multicolored. Being multicolored, in this example, is a holistic property, depending on the nature of the individuals, but not reducible or equivalent to them. The political virtue of moderation, as Socrates conceives of it, is the same kind of holistic property, belonging to the whole and not to the parts. It is not the case that the city is moderate because each class is moderate, rather, the city is moderate because the different classes agree about who should rule, just as the basket of balls is multicolored even though none of the balls are. Socrates' talk of better and worse parts may be easier to hear when the parts in question are parts of the soul rather than the city. Thinking of the guardians as naturally better than the craftspeople has a dissonant ring to egalitarian ears. As we noted when discussing the noble falsehood, the kind of equality that most readers will insist on, and which Plato has Socrates denying, is not factual equality. Some people can run or swim faster than others, some people are better at knitting than others, some people are better at differential equations than others. What is at issue is political equality, the belief that all citizens have equal rights to participating in the political life of their communities. We will see in the next chapter that Socrates expresses the view that being a woman does not in itself disqualify a person from being a guardian. But he certainly does not think that all women, or all men, are capable of being guardians, since so very few of us are capable of acquiring the requisite virtue, wisdom. We will return to this topic in the next chapter and then again when discussing Plato's attitudes toward democracy in chapter 12, so for now the egalitarians among us should merely note our disagreement with Plato. But we should also be thinking of how we might go about trying to convince him, drawing on premises he himself would accept, that he is mistaken to reject political equality. It is not an easy task. But, as I have said before, one of the great benefits of carefully reading the Republic is that doing so can lead us to wrestle with difficult tasks like this, to question and defend propositions that seem self-evident to us but do not so appear to others. Justice. Since 3 of the 4 cardinal virtues have been identified, Socrates thinks that justice must be whatever is left. Justice, it's what is left over, does not exactly inspire confidence either as a bumper sticker or a philosophical methodology. But Socrates' point is that the answer to the Republic's first question is staring them in the face, so to speak. They have been talking about it without even knowing it, he thinks, because justice is based on, and indeed seems to be a moralized version of the specialization principle. Justice, he says, is doing one's own work, and not meddling with what is not one's own. Although it is initially stated in terms of individual behavior, justice as a virtue of the polis is really a matter of each class doing its work. The craftspeople produce and exchange goods, the auxiliaries protect the city, and the guardians govern it. If this is indeed what justice is, Socrates' earlier insistence that the guardian's most important task is to protect against the mixing of the metals grows in importance. If their task is to ensure justice and prevent its opposite, then they must prevent the craftspeople from ruling, since, the noble falsehood informed us, the city will be ruined if it ever has an iron or a bronze guardian. When cobblers bake and bakers cobble, the city will have suboptimal bread and sandals, and not enough of them, since this violates the specialization principle, which requires specialization as a way of producing more plentiful and better quality goods. But occupation switching is disastrous, and not merely suboptimal, when bakers and guardians switch roles. A baking guardian who lacks the baker's skill will produce bread that is not very good, but a ruling baker who lacks the guardian's wisdom will produce disaster, on Socrates' view. Justice as non-meddling has intriguing parallels in Confucius' Analects. When asked about good governing, Confucius replies, "The ruler must rule, the minister minister, the father father, and the son son." Underlying Confucius' somewhat odd way of making his point is that roles are not merely descriptive but rather normative, providing rules and norms of conduct. This echoes the discussion of the precise sense of craft terms such as ruler back in Book 1. A widely heard complaint about contemporary American parenting is that too many parents seek to be their children's friend. Searching Google or Yahoo for "be a parent not a friend," for example, yields millions of hits. But even without investigating the complaint's merits, we see its point, which is both a Platonic and Confucian one. We each inhabit many roles: citizen, friend, neighbor, mother, cousin, customer, boss, etc., and it may not always be clear which role is appropriate in a given situation. To a great degree, practical wisdom is a matter of seeing which role is appropriate in the circumstances so one can then act accordingly. And of course it is not always clear what the role requires, even when one determines which role is called for. It may be that in interacting with a particular employee on a particular day, being a friend rather than a boss is what is called for. But it may be that a different situation calls for just the opposite. Although this idea of the normative status of roles is plausible and intriguing indeed, Confucianism is often thought of as a kind of role ethics. Many readers will be understandably uncomfortable with the political implications of Plato's role-based account of justice, rejecting the idea of assigning to a fellow citizen the rank appropriate to his nature, for it seems an easy, morally problematic slide from here to insisting that others know their place. Role ethics is a fascinating topic, but exploring it in more depth would take us too far afield. So instead, let us briefly explore two arguments Socrates makes in support of his definition of political justice. The first argument is explicitly marked in a way that should garner our attention. Look at it this way if you want to be convinced, Socrates says. The argument turns on the proper role of a judge, which is not surprising, given the focus on roles. The ideal city's rulers will also be judges, Socrates argues, and a judge's sole aim is that no citizen should have what belongs to another or be deprived of what is his own, because this, intuitively, is just. Therefore, Socrates concludes, the having and doing of one's own would be accepted as justice. This seems plausible, and Glaucon finds it so. But a more critically disposed reader might question the sudden appearance of doing one's own in the conclusion, when the premises have concerned only having one's own. Socrates' argument is commonsensical and intuitive because it concerns property. Justice requires that I not be wrongfully deprived of my property. Is what one does properly thought of something one has? Are one's roles to be counted among one's property? Perhaps, but if being, doing, and having are distinct metaphysical categories, we should be leery of fusing them into each other. The second argument is also simple and straightforward. Since meddling and exchange between these three classes, that is, the mixing of the metals, is the greatest harm that can happen to the city and injustice is the worst thing one can do to one's city, it follows, Socrates argues, that meddling is injustice. And if meddling is injustice, it must follow that its opposite, not meddling, is justice. A reader who suspects that this argument begs the question that it assumes the truth of what it is trying to prove seems to be on the mark. Only someone who already accepts the proposed definition of justice would accept the argument's first premise, that meddling is the worst evil that could befall the city. And even waiving that worry, egalitarian-minded readers who are friendly to democracy are likely to think that the first premise is simply false. They are likelier to think that the hierarchical, elitist structure of Socrates' ideal city is among the worst evils that can befall a political community. And sharp-minded readers will wonder whether Socrates is confusing cause and effect, thinking that even by Socrates' lights the meddling itself is not the great evil but rather is the cause of the evil, which presumably is the disintegration of the city. Many such readers will be skeptical that meddling or metals mixing will cause the great harm Socrates claims for it. In addition to these external worries about Socrates' definition of justice, there is an internal worry about it that is, a worry from within Socrates' point of view concerning the cardinality of the cardinal virtues. Piety, the reader will remember, is treated elsewhere in the Republic and elsewhere in Plato's dialogues as a distinct virtue in its own right. But Socrates does not count it as a cardinal virtue, or even mention it, in Book 4. Earlier I suggested that attempting to regard piety as a form of justice, and thus retaining Socrates' view that there are only 4 moral virtues, did not pan out. Here, the concern is that justice, as Socrates describes it, and moderation are so similar that it is difficult to count them as 2 virtues. A city is moderate when all 3 classes share the same belief about who should rule, and it is just when each class does its own work, but it is hard to see how those are really different, since each class doing its own work seems to be the embodiment of the agreement. Although making an agreement and acting on it are not the same thing as anyone who has had a contractual dispute or, to choose a homier example, anyone who has experienced a child not being willing to go to bed at the agreed-upon time, can attest the difference here does not seem sufficient to justify viewing moderation and justice as distinct cardinal virtues. If we are tempted to insist that the difference between agreement and action is sufficient to justify claims of cardinality, we might find our position turned against us. After all, an opponent might argue, could not the same be said about courage? Surely a belief that X is an appropriate object of fear and acting on that belief are not the same thing, even if they are closely related. If so, there would need to be another virtue, related to but distinct from courage, and if that is the case, then Socrates is mistaken that there are 4 virtues. While Socrates does not wrestle with this problem directly, his view that justice is a sort of meta-virtue might implicitly solve his problem. The prefix meta- suggests a higher level or higher order aboutness. Metacognition is cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking. Though it is often more at home in psychological contexts, there is a sense in which we are engaged in metacognition here. We are thinking about Plato's thinking about justice. So to call justice a meta-virtue is to suggest that it is a virtue about the other virtues. Even so, there is a sense in which thinking of justice as a meta-virtue can be misleading. Cognition comes before metacognition. There is no thinking about thinking unless there is first some thinking to think about. But on Socrates' view, justice comes before the other virtues. It is the condition of their possibility, the power that makes it possible for them to grow in the city and that preserves them when they have grown for as long as it remains there itself. It is worth emphasizing the word power in this description. The Greek word is delta nu alpha mu iota, dunamis, from which the English word dynamic derives. Justice is a power that enables agreement about who should rule. It is what makes it possible for there to be an agreement in the first place. Justice so conceived is not merely everyone's doing his own work, but is rather the power that consists in everyone's doing his own work. Similarly, courage is not merely the correct belief about what is appropriately feared, but is the power to preserve through everything, the belief about what things are to be feared. Earlier, I emphasized the belief at the center of courage, to draw a contrast with the knowledge that constitutes wisdom. Indeed, that is what enabled the imaginary interlocutor above to drive a wedge between belief and action. Reminding ourselves that courage is not merely a belief, but rather the power to preserve that belief through thick and thin, closes that gap. Socrates' idea that justice is what makes the other virtues possible certainly makes sense for moderation, especially if we remember that the shared agreement about who should rule is a symptom of a well-governed city, and not, as we moderns tend to think, the ultimate condition of the government's legitimacy. It seems initially to make less sense for courage and wisdom, since they are particular rather than holistic virtues, virtues distinctive of particular classes rather than of the city as a whole. Would-be rulers and auxiliaries still possess their distinctive virtues even if justice did not prevail in the city? Those capable of ruling would still know what is best for the city as a whole even if they are not in fact ruling, and the same would seem to go for would-be auxiliaries. Indeed, just these sorts of situations arise as the ideal city begins to disintegrate, as described by Socrates in Books 8 and 9. Perhaps. But the time and attention Socrates has devoted to education in the ideal city suggests that while wisdom and courage can be defined and understood independently of justice, they cannot be manifested or made real in its absence. Much of the program of education Socrates spells out in books 2 and 3 is devoted to educating the auxiliaries. He will return to education in Book 7, but there his focus will be on educating the guardians, sketching out a program that will ultimately enable them to grasp the nature of goodness itself, which they will need if they are to know what is best for the city as a whole and not merely have correct beliefs about this. So even if we can understand what courage and wisdom are independently of justice, we can imagine Socrates saying, those virtues will never come to be without the rigorous educational program of books 2, 3, and 7, which is why it is so crucial for the guardians to defend it and resist all attempts to change it even slightly. In Book 3, Socrates indicates that the guardian's most important task is to prevent the mixing of the metals described in the noble falsehood. There is nothing that they must guard better or watch more carefully than the mixture of metals in the souls of the next generation. What he says in Book 4 initially seems to conflict with this, since there he suggests that their most important task is to guard the one great thing, education and upbringing, that those in charge must cling to education, guarding it against everything. It seems that these distinct tasks cannot be the one most important task. But indeed, they really are one and the same task, since the only way to prevent the mixing of the metals is to preserve the educational system. Indeed, as we will see when Socrates describes the disintegration of the ideal city in Books 8 and 9, the decay begins when they have less consideration for music and poetry than they ought. And then they will neglect physical training. These changes to education are quickly followed by intermixing of iron with silver and bronze with gold. So while justice is conceptually distinct from the other cardinal virtues, they depend upon it for their coming into being in the city. Justice and the other virtues, while conceptually distinct, are not really or existentially distinct. Justice is the condition of their coming into existence. Thus it is a tad misleading to call it a meta-virtue, since it is about the other virtues in a distinct way. It is the condition of their reality. It is their basis, their rocae, archi, or foundation. Chapter 6. The Republic's First Question. Whatever worries or quibbles we might have about Socrates' definition of political justice, Glaucon finds it satisfactory. I agree. Justice is that and nothing else. A reminder about methodology might be in order here. Back in Book 1, Socrates opted for question and answer over speechifying as the preferred method for investigating the nature of justice. Crucial to this method is seeking agreement with each other, arriving at a conclusion from shared premises, and then in turn treating that conclusion as a premise from which to derive new conclusions. Sometimes Glaucon and others seem too ready to agree with Socrates, and they often fail to critically scrutinize his claims, but an important feature of Socrates' method is its cooperative, agreement-securing nature. This is perhaps surprising in light of cinematic and televisual depictions of the Socratic method as a matter of antagonistic intellectual combat between a knowing professor and a terrified first-year law student. So before putting the definition of political justice to work in order to understand personal justice, Socrates wants to be sure that Glaucon accepts the conclusion of their investigation into the nature of political justice. Given the focus on theoretical city building, it is easy to forget that the political theorizing is not an end in itself, but rather a means to grasping what justice is for the individual. Now Socrates must make good on the promissory note he wrote in Book 2 and justify the assumption that city and soul are sufficiently analogous so that what is true of the former is also true of the latter. Platonic psychology, the divided soul. If Socrates is to apply what has come to light in the city to an individual, he first needs to show that city and soul have the same structure. He has been proceeding on the assumption that they do, and now it is time to make good on the big if he has been operating with, if an individual has these same three parts in his soul. In a few pages, he thinks he has done the job, noting we are pretty much agreed that the same number and the same kinds of classes as are in the city are also in the soul of each individual. How does he get there? Earlier, when discussing personal, Socrates suggested that the common-sense idea of self-control was puzzling, for it seems ridiculous that something could control itself. But he makes sense of this intuitive account of moderation by positing that the soul has parts. In a moderate person's soul, a better, rational part is in charge, governing by calculation in accordance with understanding and correct belief the worse part, which contains all kinds of diverse desires, pleasures, and pains. He now makes explicit the principle by which he arrived at this distinction, which I will call the opposition principle. The same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same part of itself, in relation to the same thing, at the same time. So, if we ever find this happening in the soul, we will know that we are not dealing with one thing but many. To get a sense of the opposition principle, suppose you have one hand in a bucket of hot water and the other in a bucket of cold water. It seems that you are both hot and cold, but how could that be, since hot and cold are opposites? The opposition principle tells us you must have parts, which indeed you, obviously, do. One of your parts is hot while the other is cold. Another example, if I am standing in one spot, but nodding my head, am I moving or not? The answer seems to be both yes and no. I am not changing my location, so in that sense I am not moving, but in another sense, I am moving, since I am moving my head. The opposition principle tells us that I must have parts, since I can simultaneously undergo or instantiate incompatible opposites. Most of us have had the experience of wanting to do something but not doing it, even when we are able. I am really hungry, and there is a piece of pizza right in front of me, but I do not eat it perhaps because I see that it is your pizza, not mine, and I think that I should not take what is not mine. I am really jonesing for a cigarette, yet I do not light up, not because there are no cigarettes available, but because I am trying to quit. Whatever the details, the question is essentially the same: what explains my having a desire or appetite that I am able to fulfill but do not? It might be that I have another desire, and that both of these desires cannot be satisfied at the same time. If I am really, really hungry and really, really, really tired, whichever one is stronger, whichever has more reallys, will probably determine what I do. A conflict of desires shows that I have many desires, but not that my soul is divided. But the kinds of cases Socrates discusses are not like that. They are cases in which I choose not to act on my desire because I have a reason not to do so. In these sorts of cases, the opposition principle tells me that my soul must have at least two parts, one appetitive and one rational. But Socrates soon comes to see that there must be a third part, as well.
Do we do these things with the same part of ourselves, or do we do them with three different parts? Do we learn with one part, get angry with another, and with some third part desire the pleasure of food, drink, sex, and the others that are closely akin to them? Or, when we set out after something, do we act with the whole of our soul, in each case?
Now he suggests there is a third part, spirit, in addition to reason and appetite. In contrast to the rational part, which is the part of the soul with which it calculates, and the irrational appetitive part, which is the part with which it lusts, hungers, thirsts, and gets excited by other appetites, for point 439d, there is also the spirited part, by which we get angry both at others, when we have been treated unjustly, and also at ourselves, when we have acted unjustly. To illustrate this, Socrates offers the rather disturbing example of Leontius' necrophilia.
He had an appetite to look at them, but at the same time he was disgusted and turned away. For a time he struggled with himself and covered his face, but, finally, overpowered by the appetite, he pushed his eyes wide open and rushed towards the corpses, saying, "Look for yourselves, you evil wretches, take your fill of the beautiful sight."
Leontius' spirited element makes war against the appetites but ultimately loses, giving in to a desire that Leontius himself is disgusted by, which results in his self-directed anger. Let us pause for a moment and consider the role disgust plays in the Republic. Socrates has praised the person of godlike character who is disgusted by injustice, in contrast to the unjust person who has no scruples about, is not disgusted by, doing injustice. The would-be guardians are being educated to disdain to act, to be disgusted, to act as Thrasymachus would. We have already remarked upon the moral point of their aesthetic education, the point of which is to acquire the right distastes. It is the same Greek word in all these passages, delta upsilon sigma chi epsilon rho alpha nu omega, dusterteno, to be unable to endure, to be disgusted with. Disgust at rotting meat seems to be a universal human reaction, one we come to naturally, without learning. But moral disgust is a product of education and upbringing. Someone raised on the Thrasymachus plan will fail to be appropriately disgusted at wrongdoing and other modes of moral ugliness. And unlike its physiological counterpart, moral disgust is conceptual. It is not the thought of rotting meat that disgusts us, it is the smell of the rotting meat itself, although physical revulsion may well arise if I imagine rotting meat robustly enough. I should be morally disgusted at witnessing an outrageous act of injustice, but if I have been properly raised, I should also feel moral disgust at the thought of injustice and be angry about it. Leontius was disgusted both by the corpses and by his attraction to them, which suggests that his problem is not that he lacks the right distastes. His problem, rather, is that his soul is not properly aligned, his spirited part is not strong enough to overcome his appetites, and thus it sides with them rather than with reason. A conflict between reason and desire, between what we think we ought to do and what we want to do, is a common feature of the human condition. On Plato's psychology literally, his logos of the psyche, the conflict requires a third party for its resolution, spirit, which sides with reason in a well-ordered soul, and with appetite in a poorly ordered one. Spirit is by nature the helper of the rational part, Socrates says, but to call the arrangement natural is not to say that it will occur all by itself, without outside help, but rather that this is what spirit's function is. Spirit will perform its natural function provided that it has not been corrupted by a bad upbringing. It is telling that spirit is defined as the part of the soul we get angry with, for anger of a particularly moral type, resentment or indignation can be the appropriate emotional response to injustice suffered or witnessed, respectively, just as shame, a kind of moral self-disgust, is the proper emotional response to having acted unjustly. Spirit, like reason but unlike appetite, is evaluative, but its evaluative scope is narrower than reason's. Spirit seeks to protect its distinctive good, honor, and views the actions of oneself and others through this lens. Many philosophers agree with Geoffrey Murphy's view that wrongdoing can communicate the demeaning message that it is permissible for the wrongdoer to treat the victim as they do, and that the victim's anger, which often involves a desire to retaliate, can be seen as a way of denying the wrongdoer's demeaning message. Point 1. While spirit is able to see what is good and bad for it and to defend its own turf, it is not able to see what is good, all things considered. That is reason's task. When one has been wronged, the spirited part of the soul typically burns with anger and a desire for revenge, to negate the demeaning message the wrongdoing seems to encode. It would be good to harm him in return, it seems to say. But spirit is the part that is angry without calculation. Where spirit is passionate and hot, reason is detached and cool, seeking what is advantageous for each part and for the whole soul rather than for any particular part. Reason might offer an alternative interpretation of the event that has angered passion, suggesting perhaps that the wrongdoer did not mean it that way or that it was an accident, etc., and thus that spirit's anger is unjustified, so retaliation is inappropriate in this case. Or reason might reject retaliation altogether, since it is never just to harm anyone, as Socrates argued in Book 1. The upshot of all this is that spirit is distinct from appetite and reason, though it shares affinities with each. In a well-ordered soul, spirit can be called to heel by the reason within, like a dog by a shepherd. Of course, this order must be cultivated from an early age, by the proper balance of musical and physical training. Overdoing physical training results in someone who is under-responsive to the demands of reason and who, like a rogue soldier, is unable or unwilling to obey orders. Underdoing physical education results in someone unable to subdue the appetites and passions. Readers familiar with Freud's psychology will see an intriguing parallel between the roles reason, appetite, and spirit play in Plato's psychology and the roles ego, id, and superego play in Freud's. The personal virtues. Having secured agreement that the soul has the same three-part structure as the ideal city, Socrates has justified to his companions' satisfaction the dangling if at the heart of their method of investigating personal justice. If the assumption that city and soul are isomorphic, that they have the same three-part structure, were false, then we would have no reason to think that anything we have discovered about the nature of the political virtues tells us anything about the nature of the personal virtues. But having justified the hypothesis that underlies their method at least to the satisfaction of Glaucon and Adiamantus, they can now apply what has come to light in the city to an individual. Socrates makes quick work of the first three personal virtues, each of which is parallel to the corresponding political virtue. Just as political courage involves preserving law-inculcated beliefs about what are appropriate objects of fear, personal courage is not the preservation of innate or natural or accidentally acquired beliefs about what is to be feared, but rather the declarations of reason about what is to be feared and what is not. In a well-ordered soul, the rational part is the part making these declarations, since it is the part capable of knowledge of what is advantageous for each part and for the whole soul, which is wisdom. As with political wisdom, personal wisdom requires the capacity to see the big picture. We encounter a problem when we try to map political moderation onto the individual soul. Like political moderation, personal moderation involves harmony. The Greek word is sigma upsilon mu phi omega nu alpha, symphonia, whence the English word symphony between the rational and appetitive parts of the soul. With political moderation, this agreement is not merely practical, as when we say things like, cabin life really agrees with him, or when subject and verb agree in a grammatically coherent sentence. It is also cognitive. The ruler and the ruled believe in common that the rational part should rule. But in the soul, the irrational appetites are parties to the agreement, and it is hard to see how mere appetites like hunger and thirst can agree with anything in the cognitive sense. One implication of the otherwise puzzling claim that each appetite itself is only for its natural object is that the appetites are non-cognitive, non-evaluative drives incapable of belief, judgment, and agreement. There is no corresponding head-scratching about the craftspeople agreeing with the guardians that the latter should govern the polis, since the craftspeople are people and thus capable of agreeing and disagreeing with claims or propositions. Personifying the parts of the soul helps us to make sense of Socrates' account of moderation as a personal virtue, but in addition to the weirdness of thinking of appetites as being like persons, capable of forming beliefs and of making agreements, personifying the parts of the soul puts us on the road to an infinite regress. A person's soul comprises 3 parts, each of which is itself a miniature person or is like one, but then each of these miniature subpersons would comprise even more miniature sub-subpersons, and on and on. Like the poet Walt Whitman, we contain multitudes, apparently. Perhaps Socrates' talk of agreement between the rational and irrational parts should be taken metaphorically. Socrates regularly appeals to metaphors in the Republic, such as the famous allegory of the cave and the less famous, but no less important, metaphors of the sun and the divided line, which we will soon be exploring. But while thinking of personification metaphorically staves off the looming infinite regress, it leaves unexplained just how the irrational and rational parts come to an agreement. Are we letting Socrates off the hook too easily if we accept his metaphorical explanation? Albert Camus raised a parallel worry about metaphorically explaining the atom by appealing to the solar system. You tell me of an invisible planetary system in which electrons gravitate around a nucleus. You explain this world to me with an image. I realize that you have been reduced to poetry. So that science that was to teach me everything ends up in a hypothesis, that lucidity founders in metaphor, that uncertainty is resolved in a work of art. Though I understand his complaint, it seems that Camus fails to appreciate the cognitive power of metaphor, which is odd, given the centrality of the metaphor of Sisyphus to his account of the human condition. Are metaphorical explanations intrinsically problematic, as Camus seems to suggest? Metaphorical explanations are problematic when the metaphor that is offered to clarify the target concept is itself unclear or insufficiently understood. If the physics and nature of the solar system are well understood, why would appealing to the metaphor of the solar system be problematic? Perhaps Plato is here reminding us that we have agreed to forego the longer and fuller road that leads to precise answer S, in favor of a less demanding path that leads to a vantage point from which we see the same truths as we would from the more demanding path, but we see them less clearly and distinctly, from a distance. Walking the longer road of dialectic requires doing without hypotheses and metaphors, Socrates tells us later, but we will find them helpful while walking the less demanding trail we are on. Interestingly enough, Socrates does not exactly go in for personification of the soul's parts in a metaphor he explicitly endorses later in the Republic. In the image of the soul in words he offers in Book 9, the appetitive part is not a person but rather a multicolored beast with a ring of many heads that it can grow and change at will. While we might worry about the capacity of such a creature to form beliefs and agreements, remember that in distinguishing political courage from its natural analog, which resembles, but strictly speaking is not courage, Socrates notes that animals and slaves can possess correct belief about what is appropriately feared, however such beliefs are not the result of education. nor inculcated by law, and thus they cannot possess courage proper, but only its natural facsimile. While the hydra-headed beast representing the appetites can come to obey the commands issued by the rational part, as a dog can come to obey its master's commands, it is a stretch to think the beast or the dog agrees in the robust cognitive sense required. So it seems there is a glitch in the city-soul analogy, but perhaps such glitches are to be expected on the less precise path we are treading, since an analogy need not be perfect for it to be correct and helpful. Personal justice, intrapersonal being versus interpersonal doing. Finally, we get Plato's answer to the Republic's first question. Just as a city is just when each class does its own work, a person is just when each part of the soul does its own work. A person who possesses a just soul will do their own work, bakers will bake, cobblers will cobble, auxiliaries will defend, guardians will rule, etc. But the essence of justice is the harmony of the soul's parts, not the individuals acting in certain ways. Socrates' definition of justice is strikingly different from the definitions Polemarchus and Cephalus offered in Book 1. To think of justice as telling the truth and paying one's debts, or to think of it as benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies, is to think of justice primarily in terms of how one acts toward others. While Socrates thinks that the just person will treat others in certain ways, he does not think of justice primarily in terms of action. Justice is not concerned with someone doing his own externally, but with what is inside him, with what is truly himself and his own. So were Cephalus and Polemarchus, both spokesmen for the common-sense morality of the day, think of justice as a matter of what one does, Socrates thinks of it as primarily a matter of how one is, of what one is like, internally. The essence of justice is not to be found in external, interpersonal doing, but rather in internal, intrapersonal being. That is quite a shift, so much so that some philosophers think that Socrates has changed the subject and indeed has committed the fallacy of irrelevance. Point 3. Although I understand the point of this objection, I cannot say that I find it compelling. Socrates has not really changed the subject so much as deepened it. Polemarchus is thinking of justice in terms of action, but Socrates argues that it is something more fundamental than that Polemarchus' thinking is literally too superficial. It is looking at the surface manifestations of justice without understanding its underlying essence, just as someone who thinks of water in terms of clarity and wetness is missing its molecular essence. It is not that Socrates is unconcerned with just actions, but rather that he thinks they are really merely expressions of the underlying virtue, to be explained in terms of inner character. The action is just and fine that preserves this inner harmony and helps achieve it. As we noted earlier, Plato is offering what is nowadays called a virtue ethics, which takes the virtues to be morally fundamental. Consequentialist moral philosophers like John Stuart Mill think that good outcomes are morally basic, explaining right action and virtuous character in terms of those outcomes. An action is right if and only if it produces the best possible, or a sufficiently good, outcome, and a virtue is a reliable disposition to bring about good outcomes. Deontological moral philosophers such as Immanuel Kant deny that right action is to be explained in terms of good consequences, thinking that certain kinds of action are right in themselves. For deontologists like Kant, virtues are dispositions to do one's duty. Although this is a bit of a simplification, moral theories can be distinguished by which family of moral concepts virtues, outcomes, duties they take to be explanatorily basic in the sense of explaining or defining the other moral concepts. Although deontology and consequentialism have dominated modern moral philosophizing in the English-speaking world for several centuries, virtue ethics has enjoyed a revival in recent decades. The basic idea, really, is that being a certain kind of person is morally more fundamental than doing certain kinds of actions. While the consequentialists and deontologists focus on actions, although they differ strenuously in what explains why right actions are right, virtue ethicists focus on persons and their characters, thinking that someone in whom the virtues have been cultivated by upbringing, education, and individual effort can be trusted to figure out what action to perform in whatever circumstances they find themselves. So, for a virtue ethicist such as Plato, an action is just because it is the sort of action a just person would perform in the circumstances. Now, merely doing what the just person does is not enough to make one just. There is a distinction between doing a just act and being just. If I am doing what the just person would do, then I am acting justly, but I might not yet possess the virtue of justice. Plato's student Aristotle insisted that to act justly, I must do what the just person does, but to be just, to possess the virtue of justice, I must perform just acts as the just person performs them. I must be properly motivated, which requires at a minimum that I be motivated by what is fine or noble, what is Kalin, that crucial concept we encountered in books 2 and 3, rather than by self-interest, and that, with a few exceptions, we enjoy or at least are not internally resistant to performing the action. Socrates puts his definition to the test by asking Glaucon what kind of acts the just person, as they have defined her or him, will and will not perform. Socrates is asking Glaucon whether the proposed definition of personal justice squares with common sense. If the just person, as conceived of by Socrates, would rob temples, steal, betray friends, or break contracts, a list of unjust actions which Thrasymachus earlier specified as parts of injustice and which will be noted later as typical of people with tyrannical souls, then the definition must be rejected, just as Cephalus and Polemarchus' definitions were rejected for having implications that they themselves could not accept. If Socrates' definition implied that a just person would perform such actions, it would theoretically be open to Glaucon to still accept the definition and change his mind about the moral status of thievery, temple robbery, betrayal, etc. But that would sound the death knell for Socrates' moral theory and would be rhetorically disastrous. Glaucon agrees that the just person would not perform these kinds of actions, the kinds of actions we can expect of someone wearing Gyges' ring, of someone who thinks they can do injustice with impunity. Socrates thinks his just person is incorruptible. They are delta alpha mu nu tau iota nu omicron, adamantinos adamantin, made of steel, unshakably committed to justice and disgusted by injustice. As Socrates has defined it, justice, which, we should remember, is best thought of as virtue generally, is a kind of inner, psychic health. Virtue seems, then, to be a kind of health, fine condition, and well-being of the soul. This is unsurprising, given Socrates' moral realism. There are facts about what health is and what contributes to it, and we are likely to roll our eyes at someone who says, who's to say that a diet of potato chips and ice cream is unhealthy? Experts and indeed anyone who understands nutrition is to say, we want to respond. As a kind of inner health and harmony, virtue is similarly susceptible to this same kind of realism. If Socrates is right, there turn out to be moral facts, just as there are dietary facts, and what those facts are is not up to us in any meaningful way. We may be unaware of these facts, but we discover them, we do not invent them. There is an objection we should address before closing. The objection turns on Socrates' emphasis on inner harmony in his account of justice. For example, he says that the just person harmonizes the three parts of himself like three limiting notes in a musical scale, high, low, and middle, that he becomes entirely one, moderate and harmonious. Moreover, the action is just, that preserves this inner harmony and helps achieve it. The objection is that inner harmony is compatible with injustice. Consider a harmonious psychopath in whom reason, with the aid of spirit, rules the appetites. The psychopath does not really want to kill and eat other human beings, but believes that reason commands him to do so. So, the objection goes, if a harmonious soul is a just soul, it follows that a Socratically just person could do these awful things. But clearly a just person would not murder and cannibalize, let alone rob temples and break promises, so Socrates' account must be rejected. Given what he says in Book 9, we can imagine that Socrates might respond by insisting that our harmonious psychopath has a tyrannical soul, which is highly disordered and unharmonious, that our imagined counterexample is not really conceivable. But this seems to simply beg the question, to assume the truth of the very thing that Socrates is supposed to be arguing for. A better response would be to point out that while harmony is a necessary condition of a soul's being just, that is, a soul cannot be just without also being harmonious, it is not by itself sufficient, that is, it is false that any soul that is harmonious is thereby just. It is not that a harmonious soul is a just soul, as the objection assumes, but rather that a just soul is a harmonious soul. It is not enough that the rational part governs, Socrates should reply. It must get things right. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge, and knowledge requires truth. We can only know what is true, and it is not true that murder and cannibalism are morally permissible, other things being equal. We can probably imagine circumstances in which they might be, but the remorseless, harmonious psychopath we have imagined is not in such a situation. It should not be surprising that Socrates' response presupposes moral realism. He thinks that moral knowledge, which presupposes moral truth, is possible. Such knowledge is rare and limited to philosopher queens and kings, but it is possible. Readers who are more skeptical will take this as a point of weakness, not because they themselves reject moral realism, though some surely will, but rather because Socrates' response presupposes moral realism without ever arguing for it. Even if we share his belief that there are genuine moral truths, we might find ourselves in a situation analogous to the situation Glaucon and Adeimantus found themselves in Book 2, agreeing with Socrates but seeing that our belief in moral realism is not justified. Of course, that does not make it false, but it leaves us in an epistemically perilous state. Socrates, we should remember, does not claim to know that moral realism is true. He is working with what his interlocutors believe, so his assuming the truth of moral realism is not problematic from within the framework of the Republic. But from outside that framework, as critical readers and thinkers, we should find it problematic if we agree with him but can offer no arguments that would justify that agreement. Many readers will find this account of justice intuitively appealing, especially as it places reason at the center or, perhaps better, at the helm of a well-lived life. Socrates will discuss the varieties of unjust souls in Books 8 and 9, but it will be helpful to trace one out here, if only briefly, in order to give us a richer sense of this account of justice. A clear, illustrative contrast is with a soul and city he deems oligarchic, one which takes amassing wealth to be life's ultimate purpose. While the just person loves virtue, the oligarch loves wealth. As Socrates describes the oligarch, they are still more or less conventionally decent, though they are likely to cheat a bit if they can do so with impunity. In terms of their soul structure, the most distinctive contrast is that while reason governs the just person's soul, appetite, in particular the desire for money, governs the money-loving oligarchs. For Plato, in a well-ordered and thus just soul, reason determines which ends and goals one ought to pursue. This is its task, a task that requires the personal virtue of wisdom in order to be done well. But the oligarchic money-lover has appetite setting their ends. He makes the rational and spirited parts sit on the ground beneath appetite, one on either side, reducing them to slaves. In contemporary philosophical lingo, the money-lover reduces reason to the purely instrumental role of determining the best means to achieve the end set by appetite. It is not that figuring out the most effective means to a given end is not a task for reason, it surely is. But that is not all reason is good for, and indeed, important as such reasoning is, it is decidedly secondary in importance, in Plato's view, to determining what is good in itself, what is worth pursuing as an end. The problem, Plato thinks, is that reason has only this instrumental role in the money-lover's soul, and that in determining what ends and goals to pursue, appetite is taking over a task that does not properly belong to it. Appetite is meddling and not doing its own work, as the specialization principle and justice require. Reason, not appetite, is supposed to determine which things are good, so a soul in which appetite is doing reason's work is unjust. If we are reluctant to label as unjust souls whose possessors adhere to conventional morality despite being governed by appetite rather than reason, the example of Cephalus immediately comes to mind, we can at least regard them as non-just, reserving unjust for more obviously bad folk. Though many of us are no doubt inclined to agree with Plato about the centrality of reason to a well-lived life, we would do well to remember that great 18th-century Scottish philosopher David Hume disagrees strenuously with Plato about the role reason should, and indeed can, play in a well-lived life. Hume famously says, reason is not only to be the slave of the passions, but Hume is emphatically not suggesting that we should give ourselves over to a passion for money. Instead, he is making a point about human psychology that plays up the affective, emotional side of our nature and downplays the rational. We regularly mistake the calm passions such as benevolence, kindness to children, and the general appetite for good for reason, since they lack the force of violent passions such as anger and romantic love. We will not settle Hume's disagreement with Plato here, but I raise it to remind readers that, despite the prominence of reason in the history of Western philosophy, the issue is, like most fundamental philosophical issues, not settled. Hopefully this brief foray into the oligarchic soul helps to illustrate Plato's definition of justice. Chapter 7. Questions about the ideal polis. Having answered the Republic's first question, Plato has Socrates immediately start in on its second, whether it is more profitable to act justly, live in a fine way, and be just, whether one is known to be so or not. Since his method is to work with claims that his interlocutors believe, we might have expected Socrates to pause and ask if anyone has any questions about the definition of justice they have arrived at, but instead he immediately starts in on the Republic's second question on the final page of Book 4. But as Book 5 begins, Polemarchus, who has been silent since Book 1, jumps back into the fray, piping up with some questions which will lead to a digression, as Socrates later puts it, that comprises Books V, 6, and 7, taking up about 100 pages of the Greek text. Literary artistry as a way of doing philosophy. The opening of Book 5 is subtly but strikingly similar to the opening of Book 1, and it is worth pausing to consider Plato's literary way of making a philosophical point. Book 1, readers will remember, begins with Socrates and Glaucon returning to Athens proper from its port, the Piraeus. Polemarchus' unnamed slave bids them to wait for his master, after the slave caught hold of Socrates' cloak. In the banter that follows, Socrates playfully asks if Polemarchus will let them go. It is striking and clearly no accident that this scene is more or less repeated with the same vocabulary at the beginning of Book 5. Polemarchus took hold of Adeimantus' cloak asking, "Shall we let it go?" When Adeimantus replies in the negative, Socrates asks, "What is it that you will not let go?" To which Adeimantus replies, "You." What is Plato up to here? Why does he reprise the beginning of Book 1 here at the outset of Book 5, with the same vocabulary? Although it may be just pleasing literary symmetry enjoyable for its own sake, I suspect there is more to it than that. I think that Plato is using literary form to make a substantive point about the nature of philosophy. Philosophy is always starting over, always examining its foundations. Though we have traveled quite a distance from the opening scene, the conclusions it ultimately led to, especially the account of justice as each part of the soul doing its own work, need to be scrutinized. Doing so is important given the method that Socrates and company have adopted, which relies on shared agreement about premises to derive conclusions. Plato might have made this point more directly, but making the point so subtly as almost certainly to be missed the first time around seems not just a more elegant, but a more effective way of making the point that doing philosophy well invariably involves examining one's conclusions and starting points. It is more effective, I think, since he lets his readers make this point for themselves, by prompting us to ask why he rhymes the beginnings of Books I and V. And indeed the conclusion I have drawn, that he is making a point about the nature of philosophy, is one that should itself be revisited, as there may be more going on than that, or he might be making a different point altogether. We will not pursue it any further, but I hope at least that this discussion helps readers to appreciate not just the literary quality of the Republic, but also the way in which Plato seamlessly joins literary form and philosophical content. It is one of the reasons that the Republic is a treasure that bears repeated rereading. The Three Waves. Adeimantus and Polemarchus are prompted by the implications of a nugget of common-sense Greek wisdom that Socrates utters in Book 4 after giving the rulers of the ideal city their charge to guard above everything else the program of education and upbringing they worked out in Books 2 and 3, all the other things we are omitting, for example, that marriage, the having of wives, and the procreation of children must be governed as far as possible by the old proverb, "Friends possess everything in common." While Socrates wants to avoid exploring such details, Adeimantus and Polemarchus insist that he do so. It is not that they disagree with the proverb Socrates has appealed to, but rather that it requires an explanation, lambdagam omicron, logos. They want its implications explained and justified, since they run so contrary to Athenian social arrangements and customs. When even Thrasymachus agrees, Socrates has little choice but to accede to their wishes, even though he would prefer to avoid this swarm of arguments his friends have stirred up. As at the beginning of Book 2, Glaucon and Adeimantus agree with Socrates, but they are sufficiently self-aware to see that their belief is unjustified, hence their insistence that Socrates provide an explanation a logos. The social arrangements proposed or implied in the design of the ideal city will be scrutinized by two questions: is it possible, and is it optimal? The kind of possibility in question here is not logical possibility, but rather something more along the lines of practicality. Could this arrangement be realized in an actual city? If the answer is yes, they turn to the second question, which asks whether this arrangement would be optimal or at least beneficial. In a nutshell, the questions can be collapsed into one: could we really live this way, and if so, would it be good for us if we did? In one of his not infrequent confessions of pessimism or trepidation, Socrates is leery of the line of inquiry Adiamantus and company are insisting on, since mistakes about what is the best way for humans to live, and here it is good to remember that their discussion concerns no ordinary topic, but the way we ought to live can be disastrous. A mistake here will likely lead to a true falsehood, the very worst thing to believe. But Socrates fares forward, facing each of the three waves. The metaphor of the wave is a powerful one for the residents of a seafaring polis, especially as the discussion that constitutes the Republic takes place in the Piraeus, the port of Athens. The waves come in order of increasing severity. The first concerns whether women can be guardians, the second concerns the abolition or deprivatization of the traditional family, the third concerns the ideal city itself. We will look at the first two in this chapter and explore the third in the next, since Socrates takes the end of Book 5 and the whole of Books 6 and 7 to address it. The first wave. Can women be guardians? Since friends have all things in common and the citizens of the ideal polis are friends, bringing about this friendship should be one of the fruits of the noble falsehood. The citizens will share the same upbringing and education, as well as the same jobs. There is no reason, Socrates thinks, why being female is by itself a disqualifier. Like the people listening to Socrates, many readers will be surprised by this, though probably for different reasons. Indeed, Glaucon and company find the very idea ridiculous, a complaint one encounters at least half a dozen times in one page of the Greek text. Physical education is an important part of the would-be guardian's education, and by Athenian custom much of this, especially wrestling, occurs when the participants are naked. Thus they find it difficult to take Socrates' proposal seriously. As is often the case in the Republic, in addition to the issue immediately at hand here, whether women can participate in the education required of would-be guardians, there are deeper issues which transcend the boundaries of the Republic and which should be of interest even to those who regard the ideal polis as decidedly dystopic. One, of course, is the status of women, another is the status of societal norms. As Socrates diagnoses Glaucon's reasoning, the idea of women wrestling naked is ridiculous because it is contrary to custom, pi alpha rho tau theta omicron, para to ethos. But why, Socrates asks, adhere to local custom? After all, at one point it was contrary to custom for men to wrestle naked, and that probably incited ridicule then, too. Since customs can change over time, perhaps we will give up the custom barring women from wrestling naked, too. But Socrates has a deeper point to make than that, one that challenges the normative force of cultural customs, and one that should not surprise us, given his commitment to philosophical reflection. A cultural relativist holds that an action is right, and, alternatively, wrong, if and only if one's culture approves, or, alternatively, disapproves, of it. That is all there is to rightness and wrongness. There is no culture-transcending standard by which to assess the norms of one's own culture or those of another. One problematic consequence of cultural relativism, and remember that one way to test a claim is to consider its implications, is that it makes the idea of moral progress nonsensical. Sure, we now disapprove of slavery and thus regard it as wrong, but that is not an improvement on the earlier standard, it is just a different standard. And what goes for one culture viewed over time goes for different cultures viewed at the same time. Your culture holds that women should not vote, mine holds that they should. One is not better than another. On the relativist's view, they are different, not better or worse, because to hold that anti-slavery or pro-female suffrage norms are better than their opposites requires a higher, culture-transcending standard by which to assess those cultural standards, and these are the very things denied by the cultural relativist. The argument pattern here should be familiar. A implies B, and B is false, or, at least, the person we are talking with regards it as false, so A must also be false. Consider this argument. P1. If A, cultural relativism is true, then B, the idea of moral progress is incoherent. P2. Not B, the idea of moral progress is not incoherent. C. Therefore, not A, cultural relativism is not true. The argument is logically valid, so a die-hard relativist wishing to deny its conclusion must either reject P1, holding that cultural relativism does not imply that moral progress is incoherent, or reject P2, conceding that the idea of moral progress is not coherent, after all. These are both tall orders, for relativism, holding that what one's culture approves of is right, implies that there is no standard by which to judge one culture's standards to be better than another culture's, and there is no standard by which to assess my culture's former standards and its current standards. No standard is better, they are just different. Since progress means change for the better, it is difficult to see how a cultural relativist could regard moral progress as coherent, given their insistence that there are no standards by which to assess a culture's standards. Socrates does not make the moral progress argument, but it is presumably something he would endorse, since he rejects the cultural relativism that takes one's culture's standards as sound just because they are one's culture's standards. It is foolish, he thinks, turning Glaucon's objection back on him by employing the same word, gamma-land omicron iod omicron, geloios, to think that anything besides the bad is ridiculous, and it is foolish to take seriously any standard of what is fine and beautiful other than the good. Socrates is not a nihilist or anarchist, he is not opposed to cultural norms and standards per se. It would be odd if he were, given the amount of time he has so far devoted in the Republic to an educational program designed to cultivate the right ones. What he is opposed to is uncritical acceptance of one's culture's norms, to regarding them as correct or beyond question merely because they are the norms of one's culture. That fact that one's culture approves of X and Y and disapproves of Z is one thing, whether one's culture ought to do so is a different matter entirely. The subsequent books in the Republic will reveal something of what Socrates takes the good to be, but even if we find ourselves disagreeing down the road with his particular version of moral realism, we can agree with him about the role that critical reflection and reasoned argument ought to play in determining which norms a culture ought to possess. What was ridiculous to the eyes, Socrates says, faded away in the face of what argument showed to be the best. Women wrestling naked seems ridiculous to Glaucon and his friends, but until one has scrutinized one's culture's standards, it is not clear that it really is ridiculous. Socrates' critique of Glaucon's appeal to what seems ridiculous echoes his earlier remarks on disgust and cultivating the right distastes. Finding something ridiculous differs from finding it disgusting. Laughing at something is a much weaker form of disapproval than being nauseated by it. But they are both modes of disapproval, ways of registering that something is improper. These modes of disapproval are typically not rational. We are raised to find certain things ridiculous and certain things disgusting while we are young and unable to grasp the reason. Socrates calls on reason to help determine whether what seems absurd or disgusting really is absurd or disgusting, and if so, why. If we cannot justify our tastes and distastes, perhaps we ought to give them up. In his ideal polis, no one needs to give up the norms they have absorbed from their culture, because the educational system is supposed to guarantee that the only norms and values available for absorption are correct. But those of us not raised in utopias will need to scrutinize our culture's norms and values, since we cannot be sure those norms and values are correct. To my mind, the value of liberal education, and especially philosophical education, is to be found in their enabling us to better scrutinize and evaluate the norms, values, and beliefs we were raised to have, so that we are in a position to endorse some and reject others, thereby making our norms, beliefs, and values truly our own. Without critical scrutiny, these norms, values, and beliefs are not really our own, and we are not fully free. We might be free of interference, but we lack the freedom that comes from genuine, deep self-direction. We will return to this distinction between negative and positive freedom below, in Chapter 12. Having made his general point about cultural norms, Socrates brings the argument back to the question of whether having women as guardians is possible. In a move that is a model of intellectual fairness, Socrates decides to give the argument against ourselves. That is, he articulates what he takes to be the best argument against the view he holds. It is worth pausing to admire this kind of intellectual fairness, especially as it seems in such short supply these days. How many of us, after all, are willing or able to give a fair hearing to political and moral arguments we disagree with, let alone give them a reasonable reconstruction? As we noted earlier, much political and moral debate traffics in the production and consumption of straw men. We caricature the views of our opponents and then think we have refuted our opponents by knocking down these caricatures. A quick glance at the comments section of most online newspapers should provide ample evidence for the prevalence of straw men. The argument Socrates considers is a powerful one, since it appeals to the specialization principle, which structures the economic life in the ideal polis and indeed is the basis of the definition of justice, in arguing against the view that women can be guardians. The specialization principle implies that each must do his own work in accordance with his nature. But of course, the natures of men and women are different, so how can Socrates hold that men and women may perform the same tasks? Socrates' position is self-contradictory, argues the imagined opponent. He can't endorse the specialization principle and hold that women can be guardians, since the former implies that the latter is false. It is a powerful argument, of just the sort that Socrates regularly gives against others. Although he acknowledges the argument's rhetorical force, he finds it philosophically unsatisfying, since it is an example of heuristic, which was discussed briefly in Chapter 2. The opponent, perhaps unwittingly, is quarreling or wrangling, rosade epsilon iotanu, Arisian, aiming to win the argument, rather than to get at the truth of the matter. The argument's main fault is that it fails to make a relevant distinction and so arrives at its conclusion illegitimately. Although it gets the separation principle right, it fails to distinguish different kinds of nature and employ the one that is relevant to the argument. Consider bald and long-haired men, for example, Seinfeld's George Costanza and the supermodel Fabio. Clearly their natures are different, but from that it does not follow that George cannot be a cobbler if Fabio is, because whether one is bald or has a full head of lustrous hair is irrelevant to the craft of cobbling. It is not that the bald and the tricholucious are not different, but rather that the difference between their natures is not relevant to the issue at hand. Thinking otherwise, Socrates says, is ridiculous. What is distinctive of a guardian ruler is the kind of soul they have, a soul capable of wisdom, of knowledge of what is best for the city as a whole. The primary difference between men and women is biological or physical. Somatic might be more precise. They differ only in this respect, that the females bear children while the males beget them. There is no reason to think, Socrates insists, that this physical difference must make for a psychic difference. Consider a female doctor, a male doctor, and a male cobbler. If asked, which two are more similar to each other than to the other, you would rightly respond that you cannot answer the question until you know the relevant parameter of comparison. Physically, the male doctor and male cobbler are more similar to each other than either is to the female doctor. Psychologically, the male doctor and female doctor are more similar to each other than either is to the male cobbler. The souls of cobblers differ in nature from the souls of doctors, being susceptible of acquiring a different kind of skill. Perhaps this is a difference between iron and bronze souls. But as naturally different as cobblers' and doctors' souls are from each other, they are more like each other than they are like the souls of guardians, who, rather than possessing a skill or craft, possess a virtue. All three possess knowledge, but the objects of knowledge, how to make shoes, how to cure the sick, what is best for the city as a whole, are strikingly different, and, as we saw earlier, skills are fundamentally different from virtues, insofar as skills are morally neutral while virtues are not. The upshot of all this is that men and women having all tasks in common, and especially the task of guardianship, is possible. It is not contrary to nature. While men may on average be physically stronger than women, this difference in physical strength is not relevant to ruling or soldiering, since it may well not hold in particular cases. As I write this, the world record for the marathon for men is roughly 12.5 minutes faster than the world record for women, but the fastest women's time is really fast, and is much, much faster than the overwhelming majority of men can run. It was the 23rd fastest time run that day, October 13, 2019, in the Chicago Marathon, faster than 24,604 of the men who completed the race. That men on average run or swim faster or lift more weight than women is irrelevant to what this particular woman and that particular man can do, and it is the particular person's qualifications that are relevant, not the average qualifications of groups they belong to. Having shown that it is possible for women to be guardians and to receive the same education as their male counterparts, Socrates makes short work of the other question, whether it is optimal. Given that the only thing standing in its way is unreasoned cultural prejudice, it is no wonder that Socrates regards this arrangement as for the best. After all, he reasons, why would you not have golden-souled guardians in charge, whatever their sex, given that physical difference is irrelevant to the task of ruling? Is Plato a feminist? Plato's perhaps surprising insistence that women can be guardians prompts us to ask, is Plato a feminist? To answer this question, we need to know what it is to be a feminist, a thornier task than it might at first seem. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, an excellent, free, online resource, has half a dozen entries for different kinds of feminism and half a dozen again for feminist approaches to various philosophical topics such as knowledge, the self, science, ethics, etc. I am going to make this simplifying assumption, hopefully not an oversimplifying one, that at feminism's root is a belief in and commitment to gender equality. The idea here is that men and women are morally equal, that being a woman is never in itself a reason to give a woman's interests less weight. We know that Plato is not an egalitarian, but importing a contemporary moral principle, one animating the work of Peter Singer, among others, can shed helpful light on this section's question. The principle of equal consideration of interests, PSI for short, holds that the interests of all parties affected by an action or decision ought to be given equal consideration unless there is a morally relevant fact or difference that justifies unequal consideration. The first thing to notice about the PSI is that it is a moral principle. It is not attempting to describe how people actually act and decide, rather, it is a principle about how we ought to act. A second thing to notice is that its currency is consideration, which is different than treatment. A teacher who gives every student the same grade treats the students equally, but this is not what the PSI demands. Instead, it demands that the teacher give equal consideration to all, they use the same standards to evaluate their work, do not play favorites, etc. There is a clear sense in which such a teacher is also treating their students equally, but it is worth noting how consideration and treatment differ. If there are 200 applicants for a job, the only way to treat all applicants equally in the strict sense is to hire all of them or none of them. What the PSI requires is that the prospective employer use fair standards and apply those standards equally. That is what I take a commitment to equal consideration to require. A third point worth mentioning is that the PSI mandates presumptive rather than absolute equality of consideration. It recognizes that there may be times when unequal consideration is called for, but, as the fourth point makes clear, unequal consideration is permissible only if there is a morally relevant difference between parties or a morally relevant fact that would justify unequal consideration. Psychologists are adept at discovering the factors that decision-makers take to be psychologically relevant and which explain why we often do not give equal consideration to all parties affected by our actions. But the PSI is a normative principle, not a descriptive one. It requires a morally relevant fact that justifies unequal consideration, not a psychologically relevant fact that explains it. A racist violates the PSI by taking racial difference to justify giving unequal consideration to the interests of those affected by their actions. They violate the PSI because, with very few exceptions, racial difference is not a morally relevant difference. Racial difference is clearly and sadly psychologically relevant to racists, since it helps to explain why they act and think as they do. But it is rarely morally relevant. Other things being equal, it does not justify giving unequal consideration based on race. In parallel fashion, a sexist takes sex difference to be a morally relevant difference when it presumptively is not. This is not to say that race and sex differences are never relevant. If Brad Pitt complains to Variety that the director of an upcoming film about the life of Martin Luther King, Jr. is racist because they would not even consider him for the part, we might think he is joking, since in this instance racial identity seems quite morally relevant, not least because it would be offensive to have a white actor appear in blackface to play Dr. King. More seriously, this is not to say that race and sex-based affirmative action policies cannot be justified, but rather that they stand in need of justification. Since the presumption is that race and sex are not morally relevant, the burden of justification falls on the person or policy appealing to them. Although Plato is no egalitarian, there is a sense in which he accepts the PSI. He takes the kind of soul one has gold, silver, bronze, iron to be relevant to whether one is eligible to participate in governing the polis and indeed whether one's thoughts about governing the city should be given any consideration. Readers who are egalitarian Democrats, and that is Democrat with a small d, implying not party affiliation but rather a view about who is entitled to have a say in how one's community is governed, will think that Plato is mistaken about this. Every competent adult should have equal rights to political participation. But that point aside, it is clear, I think, that Plato certainly accepts the pisi with respect to sex difference. There is no way of life concerned with the management of the city that belongs to a woman because she is a woman or to a man because he is a man, but the various natures are distributed in the same way in both creatures. Women share by nature in every way of life, just as men do. In the lingo of the pisi, for Plato, sex difference is not a morally relevant difference that would justify giving unequal consideration to the interests of men and women. We should note that the attitude that Plato has Socrates express here is deeply at odds with Athenian attitudes of their day. Women played no role in governing Athens, and well-to-do women would never be seen by themselves outside the home. His attitude would have seemed less radical in Sparta, where women were sufficiently engaged in public life for Plutarch to be able to compile a volume entitled Sayings of Spartan Women. That certainly inclines us toward a yes answer to the question of whether Plato is a feminist. Affirmative support can also be found in the second wave, which we will get to shortly. Put briefly, Plato deprivatizes and indeed abolishes the traditional nuclear family, doing away with traditional marriage and child-rearing, and instead having children raised communally by people with a natural aptitude for it. To the extent that the traditional family can be a site of patriarchal oppression, limiting which roles and opportunities are available to women, Plato's doing away with it lends support to the judgment that he is a feminist. But this very same point also provides a reason to doubt that Plato is a feminist. In addition to its commitment to gender equality, feminism is plausibly characterized as committed to recognizing and overcoming gender-based oppression, where oppression is the systematic disadvantaging of one group for the benefit of another. Although Plato has Socrates argue that it is both possible and optimal for suitable women to be guardians in the ideal polis, there is no hint that he recognizes that his culture oppresses women, nor does he aim to liberate the women of the ideal polis from oppression. His motivation in advocating gender equality is that it benefits the polis, not that doing so is a matter of social justice or fairness. If women are liberated from oppression, it is accidental rather than intentional, which is a point in favor of a negative answer to the question of whether Plato is a feminist. Another second-wave issue that counts against Plato's being a feminist is what we can call the asymmetry of possession. Possession is an asymmetrical relation, except in a metaphorical sense. I possess my possessions, they belong to me, I do not belong to them. Some relations, such as being siblings, are symmetrical. If Mary is my sibling, I am her sibling. But other relations, such as being a sister of, are asymmetrical. If Mary is my sister, it does not necessarily follow that I am Mary's sister. Given that possession is asymmetrical, Socrates saying that all these women are to belong in common to all the men, literally, they are to be kapomikronaiodinu, koinas shared in common, is problematic for thinking him a feminist. If Plato really were committed to gender equality, we would expect Socrates to then say something like, and of course all the men belong in common to all the women. But he does not, which suggests that women are not after all to be thought of as fully equal to men. The last reason against thinking that Plato, or at least Socrates, if I can depart for a moment from my practice of not worrying about distinguishing them, is not a feminist is one that many readers will already have noticed for themselves. The Republic is sprinkled with misogynistic remarks. For example, when discussing the irrational, appetitive part of the soul, Socrates says, one finds all kinds of diverse desires, pleasures, and pains, mostly in children, women, household slaves, and in those of the inferior majority who are called free. Later in Book 5, he will characterize stripping corpses on the battlefield as small-minded and womanish. In both cases, and many others, he seems to be operating with a male-female binary in which the female pole is decidedly negative. This is perhaps the kicker. In Book 8, when disparaging democracy, he bemoans the extent of the legal equality of men and women and of the freedom in the relations between them. Could a real feminist regard equality before the law as a bad thing? It is hard to see how this could be the case. The conclusion, I think, is that although there are good points to be made on the other side, Plato is not, all things considered, a feminist. Given his time and place, his insistence that there can be philosopher queens as well as philosopher kings, 7.540c, is surprising and laudatory, even if it falls short of what those of us today who are committed to gender equality and equity would hope for. The second wave. Extending the household to the polis. When discussing whether Plato was a feminist, I described the second wave as the abolition of the family. This is not quite accurate, since the operative notion for Plato is the notion of the household, omicron kappa alpha oikia, a wider notion than our notion of the family, though they are clearly related. Plato's plan is to obliterate the boundaries between households so that the polis becomes one large oikia or household. There is some scholarly controversy about whether the extension of the household applies to everyone in the polis or just the auxiliaries and guardians. Much of what Socrates says suggests the latter, but since bronze and iron parents can have gold or silver children, it is hard to see how deprivatizing the family could work unless the city is one large household. Similarly, the seriousness with which he takes the city-soul analogy, when coupled with his view that the best city is most like a single person, suggests the ideal of the polis as one big household. This is an interesting question, though perhaps of interest mainly to specialists, so, having raised it, I will set it to one side. We saw above that the women are to belong in common to all the men and, a related point which we did not mention above, none are to live privately with any man. We met this absence of privacy earlier, when toward the very end of Book 3 Socrates described what life is like for guardians and auxiliaries in the ideal polis. They live a barracks life, like soldiers in a camp, having no private property beyond what is wholly necessary, a qualification that allows a guardian to say things like, "Hey, that's my toothbrush," and no private dwellings. The end is nigh when guardians possess private land, houses, and currency, since this will distract their focus away from what is good for the community and toward what is good for them individually. The Greek phrase being translated as private is a form of delta iota omicron, idios, from which the English word idiot derives. But the implication is individuality in opposition to what is common or shared, cap omicron iota nu, koinos, or public, rather than some sort of mental thickness or incapacity, though even our word retains a bit of this when we think of an idiot as living in his own world. We should try to avoid reading our modern notion of privacy into the text here. Individual property would do just as well as a translation, especially as idios often means simply individual elsewhere in the Republic. Example, Thrasymachus argues that injustice is beneficial to the individual, delta, idia, I, or unique or peculiar. Example, Socrates insists that each craft benefits us in its own peculiar, delta alpha nu, idean, way, though peculiar has its own misdirecting connotations. The children too will be possessed in common, though here the rationale is quite surprising. They are possessed in common so that no parent will know his own offspring or any child his parent. Socrates thinks that it is obvious that deprivatizing the family would be beneficial, thinking he need only address whether it is possible to put this arrangement into practice. In an all too rare expression of disagreement, Glaucon thinks that Socrates is mistaken on this score and insists that he justify his claim that doing away with the family is a good thing. Given the centrality of family to everyday, common sense, moral thinking and to many readers' conceptions of what a happy, well-lived life centers on, Socrates faces an uphill battle. Few readers, I suspect, will find what he says fully convincing and follow him all the way to the community pull of the individual-community duality we have seen at play in the Republic, but many will be willing to move the arrow a bit more in that direction if they give Socrates a fair hearing. There is a lot to dislike in what Socrates says here. Talk of eugenics and racial purity is beyond being merely creepy in a post-Holocaust world, and raising children in rearing pens seems to fail to do justice to human dignity, just as reducing marriage to state-sanctioned sexual hookups for the purposes of producing citizens fails to do justice to the dignity of marriage. The amount of deception guardians will use to rig the procreation lotteries, which determine who will have sex with whom, and when, will probably seem to most readers to be not merely innocuous verbal falsehoods, but rather indicative of governmental moral depravity. One need not think lying is absolutely forbidden. Few of us do, really, to be troubled by lies that might even be beneficial. And many readers will doubt that the guardian's lies will be beneficial, even if they are efficient. But there are also things to like in what Socrates says. He is concerned with civic unity, with the integrity of the ideal polis. The worst thing that can happen to a city, he argues, is for it to be divided rather than united. Whatever divides and disintegrates a city is the greatest evil, he says at 5.462a, reprising and modifying a point he made when he defined political justice. We might disagree that this is the worst thing that can happen while conceding that Socrates has a point, that a fragmented, divided city or nation is in bad shape, not functioning well, not politically healthy. His concern with faction and internal strife was certainly shared by America's founders, as for example one finds in Federalist No. 10, by James Madison, though readers familiar with the history of the early United States know how strife and faction-ridden political life then was. A polis in which citizens say mine about the same things is a polis that is unified. If all the children are my children, I am unlikely to favor some over others. I will want all of the city's children to flourish and succeed, since I think of all of them as mine. It is because Socrates thinks that the best-governed city is one in which most people say mine and not mine about the same things in the same way that he thinks that an arrangement in which no mother or father knows her own child is optimal. It unifies the city, making it most like a single person. In my state of Wisconsin, about 15% of the children live in poverty. There are disputes about the correct number, since there are disputes about the proper way to measure poverty. If everyone in Wisconsin thought of these children as their children, I doubt that we would find it tolerable. We would be less likely to think it is someone else's problem to solve or to donate a few canned goods to the local food pantry and be done with it. This, it seems to me, is the viable, contemporary takeaway from Socrates' communitarianism. Many readers will look upon the familial arrangements in the ideal polis with horror, regarding them as dystopic rather than utopic. But one can be a bit more community-minded and a bit less individualistic without following Socrates all the way. If thinking about the second wave leads readers to reflect on where they land on the community-individual spectrum, and if that landing spot is where they think they ought to be landing, then we are doing what Plato really wants us to be doing, thinking for ourselves. We might find ourselves agreeing with Socrates that a life or culture too far to the individual side of the spectrum embodies a silly, adolescent idea of happiness. They currently treat each other, and stop treating other Greeks as they currently do. We saw in the first wave that, in the language of the Psi, sex was not a morally relevant difference that would justify giving unequal weights to the interests of men and women. Here, in the second wave, however, Socrates insists that race or ethnicity is morally relevant to the weighting of interests while engaging in warfare. The trouble, Socrates argues, is that Greeks are acting as though Greekness is not a morally relevant difference. They weigh the interests of Greeks and non-Greeks equally, but they should not be doing this. Greeks should give Greek interests greater weight than non-Greek interests, and thus change the ways in which they conduct the warfare that seems so inevitable in their world. It would be interesting to explore why for Plato race or ethnicity is a morally relevant difference while gender is not, but in the interest of moving forward we will set that issue aside and move on to the third wave. Chapter 8. Surfing the Third Wave. Plato's metaphysical elevator, the powers argument, and the infallibility of knowledge. Socrates regards the last of the three waves, whether it is possible for this constitution to come into being, as the biggest and most difficult one. The Constitution he refers to is not a written document as in the US or even a collection of documents as in the UK, it is the conceptual organization of the ideal city itself. Constitution translates the Greek word pi omicron lambda iota tau epsilon alpha, politia, whence the English word politics, which is in fact the Greek title of the Republic. Socrates thinks that the ideal polis is indeed possible, but the condition of its being made real is as bold as it is famous and controversial.
Until philosophers rule as kings or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures who at present pursue either one exclusively are forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evils, Glaucon, nor, I think, will the human race. And, until this happens, the constitution we have been describing in theory will never be born to the fullest extent possible or see the light of the sun. It is because I saw how very paradoxical this statement would be that I hesitated to make it for so long, for it is hard to face up to the fact that there can be no happiness, either public or private, in any other city.
Glaucon's reaction to Socrates' inspirational little speech might not be what Socrates was hoping for. He thinks people will think that Socrates is either crazy or dangerous. So Socrates has his work cut out for him. Philosopher kings and political animals. There is a lot going on in this famous paragraph. One crucial point is that political power and political wisdom are not merely separated in the non-ideal city that Socrates and company inhabit, but are in fact at odds with each other. If those with political power lack political wisdom, they will lack the virtue necessary to perform well their function, governing. Even if those in power reject Thrasymachus' self-interested conception of ruling and aim to act for the city's benefit rather than their own, they are likely to get things wrong as often as they get them right if they merely have beliefs about what is best for the city. What they need is knowledge. And those who possess this knowledge, true philosophers, have little interest in getting their hands dirty in politics, preferring a life of intellectual inquiry over political activity. Socrates thinks that this division between political power and political wisdom must be overcome, perhaps even by force, if the ideal city is to be made real. But the force in question will turn out to be the force of rational persuasion rather than physical compulsion, thus reprising the force-persuasion theme raised in the Republic's opening scene. Socrates doubles down on the importance of marrying political power and philosophy. Not only is their union the necessary condition for realizing this theoretical model of a good city, but it is also required for human happiness itself. There can be no happiness, either public or private, in any other city. It is this claim, Glaucon thinks, that people will find ridiculous or worse. But Socrates' claim has more going for it than Glaucon first thinks. Socrates is suggesting that humans, being essentially social creatures, cannot fully flourish in defective cities or when living in Thoreau-like solitude. When Aristotle says early in his Politics that a human is by nature a political animal, when he is not saying that humans love to argue about politics or anything like that, but rather that we are the kind of animal that lives in a polis, a view that Socrates surely agrees with. And many readers who are uncomfortable with Plato's community-first ethos might find that their own conceptions of a good human life involve active engagement in a community, even if only one made up of their family and friends. Socrates will have something to say in Book 6 about how one can live reasonably happily in an unjust and thus unhappy city, but only in a just city can a person fully flourish and be as happy as it is possible for a human being to be. Socrates' solution to the third wave prompts the issue which will organize the remainder of Book 5, as well as Books Virgin Islands and 7. We need to define who the philosophers are that we dare to say must rule. This project of distinguishing philosopher from non-philosopher will take us into the deep end of the philosophical pool, so to speak, since the distinction will be twofold, drawing on Plato's metaphysics, his account of the ultimate nature, structure, and constituents of reality, which will involve the famous theory of the forms, and epistemology, his theory of knowledge. Metaphysics and epistemology are intimately related in Plato's thought, as we will soon see when we examine the marquee argument of Book 5, the powers argument. It is fair to say that this is the most intellectually challenging part of the Republic, but also the most intellectually rewarding, I think. Philosophers and non-philosophers. The epistemological distinction between philosophers, who should govern, and non-philosophers, who should not, is that philosophers have knowledge of what is best for the city, while non-philosophers have belief or opinion, delta xi alpha, doxa, whence our word orthodoxy, correct belief. Indeed, at the end of Book 5, Socrates distinguishes between phi iota lambda sigma omicron phi omicron, philosophoi, lovers of wisdom, and phi iota lambda delta omicron xi omicron iota, philodoxai, lovers of belief. We met the distinction between knowledge and belief back in Book 4, where it was put to use in explaining the cardinal virtues of wisdom and courage. The distinctive virtue of the guardian rulers is wisdom, which is knowledge of what is best for the city as a whole. Courage, the distinctive virtue of the auxiliaries, is a matter not of knowledge but of belief, unshakably true belief about what is appropriately feared, but something falling short of knowledge. An auxiliary will believe without doubt that dishonor and enslavement are worse than death, but they need not know why this is the case in order to perform their function well, although they may have true beliefs about why. Plato will have more to say about how knowledge differs from belief in Books 6 and 7, especially in the analogies of the divided line and the cave. For now, it is enough to note that the distinction is at the heart of Socrates' response to the third wave: philosophers have knowledge while non-philosophers only have belief. The metaphysical distinction between philosopher and non-philosopher will turn out to be intimately related to this first, epistemological distinction, since it is a distinction between the objects of knowledge and belief. The word metaphysics often conjures up thoughts of crystals, incense, New Age healing, etc., but this is not the philosophical sense. Philosophically speaking, metaphysics concerns the ultimate nature, structure, and constituents of reality. Where natural scientists try to discover and explain causal connections between events, metaphysically minded philosophers want to understand what causation itself is. They want to know what kinds of things exist. Is everything that exists physical, or do non-physical things exist? For example, is the human mind something fully physical, reducible without remainder to the brain? Or is it something non-physical? If minds are non-physical, how do they interact with the body, which is decidedly physical? These are not the kinds of metaphysical questions that Plato asks. They assumed a central place in Western metaphysics with the thought of René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. But hopefully they give the reader a sense of what sorts of concerns are addressed by metaphysics. We have beliefs about the particular things that make up our everyday world, on Plato's view, but we have knowledge of the forms, the timeless essences of the particulars. Point 2. A brief jump ahead to the beginning of Book 10 will be helpful in getting clearer about what the forms are. There, Socrates reminds Glaucon that their usual procedure, is to hypothesize a single form in connection with each of the many things to which we apply the same name. There must be something, Plato thinks, that all just actions have in common, that all courageous actions have in common, that all red things have in common. Grasping this common feature, the essence or the form, the real definition is the task of philosophy, for Plato. His example in Book 10 is rather mundane: beds. The form, he says, is our term for the being of a bed, where being means what the thing is, its essence, what it is to be a bed. So far, assuming a common feature seems like a reasonable, innocuous assumption. While there are many particular beds and many particular just actions, there is a single, unifying form or essence of bedness and one of justice. So where particulars are many, forms are one. Another crucial difference between forms and particulars is that particulars are ever-changing. Of all the many beautiful things, Socrates asks, is there one that will not also appear ugly? Or is there any one of those just things that will not also appear unjust? Or one of those pious things that will not also appear impious? Although Plato does not share the subjectivist view that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, the beauty example is a helpful one. The sky to the west is beautiful right now, but in an hour, after the sun has set, it no longer is. Nor is it beautiful to my colorblind friend. The bouquet of flowers on the dining room table will not evoke ooze and ahs in 2 weeks. Thus, beauty seems both temporal and perspectival. As we saw in Book 1, returning the weapon you have borrowed is usually just, but in a particular set of circumstances, say, its owner is deranged, it is not. Telling the truth is usually the right thing to do, but sometimes the demands of kindness trump the demands of honesty. That fox seems big when standing next to the squirrel, but small when standing next to the bear. And so on. Being ever-changing and unstable are hallmarks of concrete particulars. Bob Dylan captures something of Plato's point when he sings, "He not busy born is busy dying." I hope my non-existence is a long way off in the future, but every day I live I am one day closer to my death, hence, I seem to be both living and dying, just as every beautiful thing seems both beautiful and not beautiful. The forms are altogether different, on Plato's view. Unlike the many particular beautiful things, the form of beauty is permanent, stable, unchanging. The beautiful itself, Socrates says, remains always the same in all respects. It is the only thing that is always and everywhere beautiful. The same goes for the forms of justice, piety, redness, bigness, whatever. While the world of particulars is in constant flux, the world of the forms is stable and unchanging. We experience particular things and events via our senses, but the forms are intelligible but not visible. We perceive them with our minds, not our senses. One of Plato's ways of referring to the form of something drives this point home. The form of a thing is the delta alpha, literally, the idea of the thing. We cannot see or taste or touch or smell or hear ideas, we can only think them. But the word idea can be misleading, since for Plato the forms are not psychological entities like thoughts or feelings, which depend for their existence on someone having them, as idea might suggest. Unlike ordinary thoughts and ideas, which cannot exist without thinkers thinking and having them, Plato's forms are mind-independently real, not depending for their existence upon thinkers thinking them. This is one of the most distinctive features of the forms. It is one thing to claim that there is a common essence shared by particular things, it is another to claim that these common essences or forms are not dependent, psychological entities, but are instead mind-independently real. While the shadow my hand casts is real, it seems somehow less real than my hand, since its existence depends on the presence of the hand. Ideas and thoughts and feelings and moods seem similar to shadows in this regard, they are dependent entities, depending on conscious subjects for their existence. Plato does not deny this. But the forms are not dependent psychological entities. It turns out that the forms depend upon the form of the goodness itself, but they are decisively unlike our ordinary ideas and thoughts. If this all sounds a bit weird, thinking about numbers can be helpful. Although the 2 coffee cups on the table are concrete particular objects, the number 2 is an abstract object, capable of being instantiated in space and time by infinitely many pairs of concrete particular objects, but it is not itself a concrete particular, at least on a plausible philosophy of mathematics known, perhaps unsurprisingly, as Platonism. One reason for thinking of mathematical objects as mind-independently real is that doing so helps us make sense of other beliefs many of us have about these objects. It will seem to many readers, for example, that the Pythagorean theorem is timelessly true and would still be true even if no person ever thought of it. We should resist the temptation to say that numbers and the forms have always existed, because always existed is a temporal notion, and the idea here is that such entities are outside of time. Plato's metaphysical elevator. We can think of Plato's metaphysics via the metaphor of an elevator, as in this diagram. At level 1, we find the everyday objects making up the world we experience through our 5 senses: trees, squirrels, rocks, picnic tables, etc. Most readers, I assume, think these objects are metaphysically real, existing independently of our minds and still there when we close our eyes or when we no longer exist. This is a plausible, common-sense philosophical view, though of course not all philosophers hold it. The great Irish philosopher George Berkeley, for one, thought that what we ordinarily take to be mind-independently real things are in reality mind-dependent ideas. We are tempted to think of them as mind-independently real because they seem to persist in our absence, but, he thought, this is only because God continues to think them when we do not. Berkeley's motto was esse est percipi, to exist is to be perceived. This seems right for headaches, for example, which require someone to perceive them. They are not floating around in space, waiting to land on an unfortunate victim. So while some philosophers will not even get on Plato's elevator at the first floor, most of us will. At level 2 we find those real definitions or essences that Socrates is forever seeking, the trait or property that all things have in common, chairness, justice itself, etc. Most readers, I suspect, will take Plato's elevator to level 2. We think that the many particular things we experience through our senses come in clusters unified by common properties. There are red things, round things, beautiful things, just and unjust actions and social arrangements, etc. Ascending to level 2 results from agreeing with Socrates that there is a single form in connection with each of the many things to which we apply the same name. Indeed, the Republic is the search for the form of justice, as many of Plato's dialogues are searches for the forms or essences of various virtues such as piety, courage, temperance, etc. But at level 2, we find forms rather than forms, since they are not mind-independently real, existing in their own right. Not everyone will follow Plato to level 2, however. The great 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889–1951, for one, declined the invitation, thinking that the search for one commonality was misguided and inevitably futile. If we consider the wide variety of games, card games, board games, ball games, party games, computer games, etc., we will see, Wittgenstein thought, that there need not be features common to everything we call a game.
Or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of solitaire. In ball games there's winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Think now of games like Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many other groups of games in the same way, can see how similarities crop up and disappear.
Instead of an essence shared by all games, Wittgenstein finds a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, which he dubs a family resemblance. Not everyone accepts Wittgenstein's view. Bernard Suits, for one, thought he had found the essence of game. But it is worth noting that contemporary psychology and cognitive science seem to side with Wittgenstein over Plato. According to prototype theory, first articulated by the cognitive psychologist Eleanor Rosch in the early 1970s, our concept of, say, bird, involves a cluster of features, some more important than others, with certain examples serving as prototypes. Point 4. If you want to give someone an example of a bird, you are likelier to offer a robin or cardinal as an example than you are to offer a penguin, because penguins lack one of the prototypical but not necessary traits we associate with birds, namely the ability to fly. Even though Wittgenstein would not ascend to level 2, preferring family resemblances to essences, many readers will follow Socrates there. It is at level 3, though, where Platonism really starts to kick in, for level 3 involves a commitment to the real, mind-independent existence of these forms or common properties. At level 3, we discover essences and forms, we do not invent them. It is one thing to regard the form or essence of justice or kindness or chairness as a psychological entity, a conceptual construct having no mind-independent existence in its own right. It is another thing entirely to regard the form as mind-independently real, something that is to be discovered rather than invented. You can ascend to level 2 while thinking that the forms are like ordinary ideas and thoughts, not real in themselves, but rather depending for their existence on thinkers thinking them. But ascending from level 2 to level 3 requires a considerable jump in what philosophers call ontological commitment, a fancy-sounding but precise phrase indicating which kinds of things one is prepared to say exist in their own right. Few people, for example, are ontologically committed to unicorns or the tooth fairy. Most of us do not regard them as mind-independently real. And while most of us think that our thoughts and feelings are real in an everyday sense, the sense which contrasts real with imaginary or hallucinatory, we do not regard them as real in the sense of existing in their own right, mind-independently. Many people who find the ascent to level 2 unproblematic and obvious will balk at ascending to level 3. Why go there, after all? It seems needlessly complicated or metaphysically profligate to posit the real, mind-independent existence of Socrates' real definitions. Many readers are familiar with Occam's razor, which in one formulation tells us that the simplest explanation of a phenomenon is usually correct. Perhaps less familiar is the ontological formulation of the razor, which bids us not to multiply entities beyond necessity, non sunt multiplicanda entia sine necessitate. In short, if you do not need to posit the existence of certain things or kinds to make sense of your experience, then don't be metaphysically frugal and parsimonious. No doubt this metaphysical or ontological simplicity is related to explanatory simplicity. Explanations involving fewer kinds of entities will probably be simpler. It is as though there is an ontology tax that philosophers are keen to avoid paying. Most of us find ontological commitment to ships and shoes and sealing wax unproblematic because it is difficult to make sense of our everyday experiences without a commitment to the real existence of the spatio-temporal objects that we sit on, stub our toes on, eat, etc. But many readers will resist ontological realism about Plato's forms, feeling they can understand and explain their experiences without appeal to them. The journalist Hunter S. Thompson once wrote, "When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. 5 if so, then level 4 is where one loses one's amateur standing." For those ascending to level 4, go beyond ontological commitment to the real, mind-independent existence of the forms that typified level 3. On level 4, the forms are not merely mind-independently real but are more real than the spatio-temporal particulars that are instances of them. The idea that the essence of chairness is more real than the chair one is sitting on is, well, pretty weird. Many people will get off the Platonic elevator at level 2, being philosophically unwilling, perhaps for Occam-inspired reasons, to ascend to level 3. But of those who go to level 3, few, I suspect, will be willing to go all the way to level 4, and readers might be forgiven for thinking that Socrates has gotten into the drugs reserved for the rulers of the city. But bad jokes aside, the drugs are not those kinds of drugs. Anyway, his reasons for ascending to levels 3 and 4 are philosophical rather than psychedelic, and it is to those philosophical reasons that we now turn. Marrying metaphysics and epistemology. The powers argument. The metaphysical and epistemological distinctions are intimately related, for Plato. In what I call the powers argument, he starts with epistemology and ends up at metaphysics, arguing that the distinction between knowledge and belief requires allegiance to the forms, since knowledge and belief, being different powers, must have distinct kinds of objects. The powers argument is crucial to addressing the third wave, since it will help define who the philosophers are that we dare to say must rule, but its implications go beyond this, as it attempts to give good reasons to ride the metaphysical elevator all the way up. The epistemological and metaphysical distinctions fit together this way: concrete particular things are the objects of belief, while the forms are the objects of knowledge. A non-philosopher has beliefs about the many particular things and activities that make up the furniture of our everyday world: chairs, just actions, cats, sunsets. They believe in beautiful things, but do not believe in the beautiful itself. The philosopher, by contrast, is able to see and embrace the nature of the beautiful itself, the form or essence in virtue of which all particular beautiful things are beautiful. A non-philosopher can have a true belief that a sunset is beautiful but never knowledge of this. Indeed, there is no knowledge of such things, as the forms and not particulars are the proper objects of knowledge, on Plato's view. But perhaps something that falls short of knowledge, but is more than true belief knowledge with an asterisk, is possible where particulars are concerned. If so, a philosopher might know asterisk that this particular sunset or that particular painting is beautiful by grasping the form of beauty and seeing that the painting or sunset is an instance of participates in, as Plato often puts it, the form, if only temporarily. Such a philosopher would know why the sunset is beautiful, which is beyond the cognitive capacities of a non-philosopher, who lacks access to the form of beauty and thus never ascends above true belief. The powers argument's crucial concept, which gives it its name, is the concept of a power, delta nu alpha mu iota, dunamis, whence the word dynamic. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell are ordinary examples of powers, which we might also call capacities or faculties. Animals typically have the power of sight, rocks do not. Even though powers are what enable us to see, hear, touch, taste, and smell the world, powers themselves are not the kinds of things we can see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. We distinguish them, Socrates says, by what they do and what they are set over by their functions and their objects. What is set over the same things, and does the same I call the same power. What is set over something different and does something different I call a different one. Talk of knowledge and belief as powers, analogous to sight and hearing, might make this first premise sound odd to modern ears, but this is how Socrates conceives of them. The second premise is the claim that knowledge and belief are different powers, which Glaucon regards as obviously true to a person with any understanding. From these two premises, Socrates concludes that knowledge and belief must have different objects. This conclusion seems innocuous enough, but we will soon see that it is anything but. Having established, he thinks, that knowledge and belief must have different objects, Socrates then tries to determine what these different objects are. Knowledge's object, Glaucon agrees, is what is. There is a trifold ambiguity here that we should be aware of. In the existential sense, what is means what exists, what is real. Someone who asks, "Is there a God?" is using "is" in the existential sense. In the epistemic sense, what is means what is true, what is the case. News anchor Walter Cronkite's signature sign-off, "and that's the way it is," employed is in the epistemic sense. In the predicative sense, is serves to link subject and predicate, "the sky is blue," Jonas Starker is a great cellist, etc. So what is means what is, where the dots are filled in with some predicate, what is red, what is beautiful, what is just, etc. Plato does not make explicit which sense of it is Glaucon has in mind when he says that knowledge's object is what is. To get a sense of the argument without becoming ensnared in scholarly controversy, I propose that we read what is in the existential sense, given the metaphysical implications of the argument. Taken this way, when Socrates says that knowledge is set over what is, he is saying that the objects of knowledge, what we know when we know something exist, they are real. and the forms exist, so they are objects of knowledge. Ignorance, by contrast, has as its object what is not, what does not exist. It is odd to think of ignorance as a power or capacity, since it does not enable its possessor to do anything, as powers usually do, but let us set aside this minor point. Since belief is in between knowledge and ignorance, darker than knowledge, but clearer than ignorance, its objects will be intermediate between what is and what is not. Thus the objects of belief participate in both being and not being, they straddle both existence and non-existence, not fully real but not unreal either. In short, the objects of belief are the particulars of everyday experience. To summarize, knowledge and belief, being different powers, must have different objects. Indeed, they have very different kinds of objects. Knowledge's objects are the timeless forms, while belief's objects are the spatio-temporal particulars that make up our everyday world. So there are two metaphysically different worlds, the world of the forms and the world of particulars. The world of the forms is the world of reality, while the world of particulars is the world of appearance, but not, I hasten to add, a world of illusion. Plato is very careful with his language here, emphasizing that those things we think of as being beautiful really only appear beautiful, since they also appear ugly. Is there any one of those just things, Socrates asks, that will not also appear unjust? Or one of those pious things that will not also appear impious? Plato is not claiming that our everyday world is illusory in the sense of not being real. It is just not as real as the world of the forms. It is smack dab in the middle, metaphysically, more real than complete non-existence, but less real than complete existence. Problems with the powers argument. That is a lot to take in, so let us pause and restate the argument in premise-conclusion form, in order to grasp its structure more clearly, which should help us analyze it. P1. X and Y are the same power if and only if A, X and Y have the same objects and B, X and Y have the same function. P2. Knowledge and belief are different powers. C1. So, knowledge and belief have different objects and different functions. C2. So, knowledge and belief have different objects. P3. Knowledge's object is what is. 5.478 AC, P4. Belief is intermediate between knowledge and ignorance. P5. Ignorance's object is what is not. C3. So, belief's object is what is and what is not. A minor detail regarding C1, Group's translation does not quite square with the Greek text here, which is better captured by C2, which logically follows from C1. I do not think anything rides on Group's edition, but some readers, especially brave souls wrestling with the Greek text, will want to know this. Let us work backwards, starting with C3. We have already noted that for Plato particular things are bundles of opposites, simultaneously beautiful and not beautiful, just and not just, etc. Each of them always participates in both opposites. But Socrates now takes this to imply that these particular things are intermediates between what is not and what purely is. This is something new. It is one thing to claim that predicates like is beautiful both apply and do not apply to one and the same particular object, that the particular thing participates in both beauty and non-beauty. But why would this imply that any particular participates in both being and non-being, that it somehow both exists and does not exist? There seems to be something a little fishy here. Socrates seems to slide from the predicative sense of is, where it links subjects and predicates, to its existential, existence-asserting sense. That is, he seems to slide from predicative, any particular thing both is beautiful and is not beautiful, to existential, any particular thing both is and is not, as if he simply crossed out the occurrences of beautiful in predicative. Bertrand Russell once wrote that employing the same word to express such different senses was a disgrace to the human race. 6 Russell's hyperbole is no doubt tongue-in-cheek, but there is a serious point in the background. Philosophy often requires attention to linguistic subtleties like the distinction between the senses of is. In this portion of the argument, Socrates seems to elide the distinction between the predicative and existential senses, drawing a conclusion employing the latter from a premise employing the former. I stress that he seems to me to be doing this, I am not insisting that he actually does so. Such insistence would violate the principle of charity, which requires us to interpret texts and utterances in ways that maximize their truth and reasonableness and logical validity. But sometimes even very smart people make logical blunders, and the principle of charity does not require us to pretend otherwise. If this were a different book aimed at a different audience, we would explore this question in depth and detail. Some people are sufficiently fascinated by issues like this as to become Plato scholars, and no doubt some of those scholars are rolling their eyes or at least arching their eyebrows at what I have said here. But and here I am on firm logical ground, this is not a different book than it is, so I tentatively suggest that we view this apparent equivocation between senses of is as a heuristic device to help us think critically about the argument and move on. These concerns about whether Socrates makes this predicative existential slide fade into the background when we see how problematic the first part of the argument is, the derivation of C1 from P1 and P2. Glaucon thinks that C1 necessarily follows from P1 and P2, but his confidence is misplaced, since the conclusion does not follow necessarily at all. Since the conclusion could still be false even if we assume that the premises are true, the argument is invalid. To see this, consider a parallel example. Two constitutional conditions of eligibility to be President of the United States are a. that one be at least 35 years old, and b. that one be a natural-born citizen. From the fact that my friend Jeff is not eligible to be president, it does not follow that he is not at least 35 and that he is not a natural-born citizen. What follows is that either Jeff is not at least 35 years old or Jeff is not a natural-born citizen. Both negative conclusions might follow, as they do in the case for my cat Frobisher, who, despite having been born here, is not a citizen of the U.S. and is well shy of 35. But all we and Socrates are entitled to is the or. If I know that Jeff is well past 35, I can then conclude that he is not a natural-born citizen, he is, in fact, Canadian. But until I know that, I am jumping to a conclusion I am not entitled to draw. What Socrates should conclude from P1 and P2 is that either knowledge and belief have different objects or they have different tasks. It might be that both their objects and tasks differ, but Socrates is not entitled to conclude that. To get to C2, the conclusion that knowledge and belief have different objects, from C1, which now functions as the premise that they either have different tasks or different objects, he has to show that knowledge and belief do not have different tasks. But without doing this, he is jumping to a conclusion C2 that he is not entitled to. So Plato, in the person of Socrates, has committed one of the gravest of philosophical sins. He has given a logically invalid argument. But even if we could fix the logical invalidity, switching the and in C1 to an or, it is difficult to see how Socrates can get to C2. Powers differ more often by having different tasks or functions than by having different objects. Shepherds and butchers, for example, share a common object, sheep, but they have different tasks in relation to that object. Shepherds seek to nurture sheep while butchers seek to turn them into lamb chops. On a common conception of education, the one we will see Plato calling into question in Book 7, teaching and learning have the same object, knowledge, but have different tasks or functions with respect to that object. Teaching seeks to impart or instill knowledge while learning seeks to acquire it. And so on. Perhaps the trouble is thinking of knowledge and belief as powers or capacities. Plato thinks that each of the senses has a distinct object, sight's object is color, hearing's is sound, etc. In the Theaetetus, a dialogue roughly contemporary with the Republic, Socrates says, "What you perceive through one power, you cannot perceive through another." Cases of synesthesia aside, this has the ring of truth, though it seems to have the odd implication that we cannot see and smell and taste the same object, when it seems clear that we can, I see the coffee, smell it, taste it, etc. But Socrates could respond that we see the coffee's color, smell its aroma, feel its heat, etc. These various sensations are synthesized or integrated into a unified sensory impression, but the various senses are modular, operating independently. We perceive the coffee by or through perceiving its sensible qualities. But, a critic might insist, it is not the case that these powers ultimately have different objects, instead, they have a common object, the coffee. It is true that their intermediary objects are different properties or qualities of that object we see color, smell aroma, etc., but there is a common object that those various sensory qualities belong to. So we have reason to be skeptical of the first premise of the powers argument. And even if we give Socrates the benefit of the doubt and take him to be talking of the various intermediate objects of these powers, not the ultimate object, we might wonder what reason we have to think of knowledge and belief as analogous to powers in having unique objects. Most contemporary philosophers would agree with the spirit of P2, since they think that knowledge and belief are different cognitive or epistemic states, though they would be unlikely to think of them as powers. Few, though, would agree with Plato's conclusion that knowledge and belief have different kinds of objects. As discussed earlier, on the JTB, justified true belief, conception of knowledge, to know something is to have a belief that is not only true but is also justified, which, on a plausible account of what it is to be justified in believing something, requires good reasons for having the belief. Most contemporary philosophers would regard C2 as false, since knowledge and belief, though different, have the same objects, propositions. In the first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln speaks of the founder's dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. If he had said it in French, la proposition que tous les hommes sont créés égaux, he would have expressed the same proposition. Even though we express propositions in language, at heart propositions are conceptual entities rather than linguistic ones, and the same proposition can be expressed in different languages. Lincoln believed in the proposition of fundamental human equality, while Plato, we have seen, did not. Both Anna, who grew up in Wisconsin and has looked at her share of road maps and atlases, and Bryce, a coastie with a vague picture of the geography of North America who has trouble locating Wisconsin on a map, for him the Midwest is a vague blobject, believe the proposition that Wisconsin is east of the Mississippi River. On the JTB conception, Anna knows this, while Bryce does not. Though Bryce's belief is true, he does not have good reasons for it, since when pressed the only reason he offers is, I just think it is. Though Anna and Bryce are in different cognitive and epistemic states, their objects are the same, the proposition that Wisconsin is east of the Mississippi River. Or so say most contemporary epistemologists. That most contemporary philosophers think C2 is false does not make it false, of course, but in the next section we will see reason to think they are probably right about this. Plato's fallible conception of infallibility. So why does Plato have someone as smart as Socrates make such a logically flawed argument? It may be that the argument accurately reflects Socrates' reasoning, which Plato faithfully reproduces, though that seems unlikely. Perhaps this is one of those instances of Plato's intentionally having Socrates make a bad argument in hopes of engaging the reader in philosophical dialogue, since the yes-men Socrates is talking with do not seem up to the task. That is certainly possible, but here it does not ring true, at least to me. In those instances in Book 1 when the bad arguments seem intentional, e.g., in Socrates' first refutation of Polemarchus, there was a substantive philosophical point that Plato seemed to want his readers to work out for themselves, that virtues are not crafts or skills. But given how much is at stake here, reasons for believing in Plato's forms, for taking Plato's elevator to the third and fourth levels, it is an odd time for such a lesson. Perhaps Plato has independent reasons for believing C2, that knowledge and belief have different objects, and this makes him less attentive than he should be to the quality of the reasons he offers here in support of this belief. It is a common enough human failing, but it is surprising to see Plato falling victim to it here. Those independent reasons for thinking C2 is true can be found in the discussion Socrates and Glaucon have about P2. Glaucon agrees, as we all should, that knowledge and belief are different. How could a person with any understanding, he asks, think that a fallible power is the same as an infallible one? The idea that belief is fallible should ring true. We regularly believe things that are not true. We think they are true, of course, and sometimes insist that they are. After all, we probably would not believe them if we knew they were false, since to believe something is, at least in part, to take it to be true. But while I can believe things that are false, I cannot know things that are false. I might believe that Orson Welles directed The Third Man or that Edward Albee wrote Desert Solitaire, but I cannot know these things, since they are false. On the JTB conception, remember, my beliefs count as knowledge only if they are true, though being true is not enough, those true beliefs also have to be justified. For contemporary philosophers, that is the sense in which knowledge is infallible and belief is fallible. I can believe things that are false, but I cannot know things that are false. Plato seems to have a different understanding of the infallibility of knowledge, one that goes beyond the view that we cannot know things that are false and holds that we cannot know things that could be false. In other words, the objects of knowledge must not only be true, they must be necessarily true. While a contingent truth could be false, a necessary truth cannot possibly be false, it must be true. The candidates for such things are few, but the truths of mathematics offer the most intuitively plausible examples of necessary truths. Although it is not completely uncontroversial, I think that the Pythagorean theorem is necessarily true, that it was true even before anyone thought of it, and would be true even if no one ever thought of it, even if no creatures capable of understanding geometry had ever existed. That the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides is not merely a mind-independent truth, it is a mind-independent truth that could not be false. Given the nature of right triangles, there is no way the square of the hypotenuse could not equal the sum of the squares of the other two sides. If there are two mittens and one stocking cap on the table, it is mind-independently true there are three things on the table. It does not matter whether I am looking at them or not, there are three things on the table. But it is merely a contingent truth that there are three things on the table. I could have just as easily kept my stocking cap on, it is cold in here, in which case there would only be two items on the table. So while it is true that there are three items on the table, it is a contingent truth. But that 3 is the sum of 1 and 2 is a necessary truth, it cannot be otherwise. And here it is important not to confuse numbers with numerals, which are our names for numbers. We could use the word 2 to name the number 3 and the word 3 to name the number 2. Heck, we could call 2 Ethel and 3 Fred. The English sentence 2 plus 1 is 3 is only contingently true, since which words attach to which objects is a contingent fact of English. But the proposition it expresses, that the sum of 2 and 1 is 3, is necessarily true, regardless of which names or numerals we use to designate the numbers. The crucial difference between these two conceptions of the infallibility of knowledge is that the contemporary conception of infallibility is a claim about the nature of knowledge, while for Plato it is a claim about the objects of knowledge. Contemporary, necessarily, if someone knows that P, then P is true. Plato, if someone knows that P, then P is necessarily true. A lot rides on where necessarily appears, or as linguists and philosophers would say, on its scope. There is a world of difference between not trying, I am not trying to hear what they are saying, and trying not, I am trying not to hear what they are saying. Not trying is true so long as I am not making an effort to hear what they are saying. Example, I am not leaning in, putting my ear to the wall, etc. If I hear what they are saying, perhaps the fault is theirs and not mine, since I was not eavesdropping. But trying not requires that I make an effort to not hear them. Example, I cover my ears, change locations, etc. If I hear what they are saying, I have failed in my attempt to not hear them. Perhaps I should have tried harder. Similarly, the difference between the contemporary and Platonic conceptions of the infallibility of knowledge is a difference in the scope of the adverb necessarily. On the contemporary account, what is necessarily true is a claim about the nature of knowledge, that if I know that P, then P is true, so I can have knowledge only of things that are true. On the account I am attributing to Plato, it is the proposition known that is necessarily true. If I know that P, then P is necessarily true, so I can have knowledge only of necessary truths, never of merely contingent truths. If Plato understands the infallibility of knowledge as I have suggested, it is no wonder that he thinks that knowledge and belief must have different objects. Only the forms, Plato thinks, have the necessity required of objects of knowledge, since only the form of beauty is completely beautiful. Particular beautiful things are too awash in contingency and opposition to make the grade. The self-predication of the forms, the view that the form of beauty is beautiful, the form of justice is just as of great interest to Plato scholars, but it is an issue we need not tangle with here. Suffice it to say that there are problems with this view. If the forms are self-predicating, then the form of beauty is beautiful and the form of justice is just. That might seem just fine, but then the form of bigness is big and the form of smallness is small, the form of redness is red and the form of squareness is square, all of which are odd implications for entities that are not spatiotemporal. Most of the truths of our everyday lives are names, where we park the car, our favorite flavor of ice cream, how many, if any, children we have are contingent truths, not necessary truths. They could have been otherwise. My parents could have named me Ivan instead of Sean. I parked the car in the street, but I could have parked it in the driveway or in the garage, etc. Things could be different than they are. On the ordinary conception of knowledge, I know that my name is Sean and that I have 2 cats. but on the stronger understanding of the infallibility of knowledge that Plato seems to have. I do not know these things, since they are only contingently and not necessarily true, and thus not proper objects of knowledge. This will strike many readers as quite counterintuitive. Most of us feel quite confident that we know our names, though where we park the car might be a different matter entirely, especially for garageless city dwellers. So it is plausible that Plato's view about the infallibility of knowledge is what accounts for his belief that knowledge and belief must have different objects. And it might help explain why he does not seem aware of the weaknesses of the actual argument he gives to support that belief. But there are still the facts that the powers argument is logically invalid and its key first premise is false. It is certainly the marquee argument of Book 5, intended to provide good reasons to accept Plato's distinctive metaphysics. Of course, Plato's metaphysics might still be correct, the conclusion of an invalid argument can still be true. But as things stand, there is a gaping hole in the middle of the Republic. Chapter 9. The Philosopher's Virtues. Although there are serious problems with the powers argument, its invalidity and unsoundness do not entail that the ideal city will get washed away by the third wave. For even if we reject the mind-independent reality of the forms or, more cautiously, regard belief in their mind-independence as unjustified, we can still agree with Plato that ideal rulers will possess knowledge of what is best for the city. Although the distinction between knowledge and belief is crucial to Plato's distinction between philosopher and non-philosopher, knowledge and belief can be different epistemic states even if they do not have different objects. So the distinction between knowledge and belief, and the distinction between philosopher and non-philosopher that it underlies, can survive the failures of the powers argument, since the distinction itself does not depend on Plato's particular way of making it. In this chapter, we will look at another way in which Plato tries to distinguish between a true philosopher and a counterfeit one. He is especially keen to distinguish genuine philosophers from sophists, the professional teachers of rhetoric whom the public mistakenly takes to be philosophers. In doing so, Plato will not only shore up his response to the third wave by further define who the philosophers are that we dare to say must rule, but he will also exonerate Socrates, who, as many readers know, was tried and convicted of impiety in corrupting the youth of Athens and put to death for those alleged crimes in BC 399. Sophists, and not philosophers, Plato insists, are guilty of corrupting the youth. In a phrase that will recall his Book 1 exchange with Thrasymachus, Socrates wants to discover who the philosophers are in the most exact sense of the term. In asking whether a soul is philosophic or not, Plato indicates that being a philosopher is a matter of nature as well as nurture. All the education and nurture in the world will not produce a philosopher if the underlying philosophic nature is not present, and improperly educating someone with a philosophic nature will not just fail to produce a philosopher, it is likely to produce moral depravity. The best natures become outstandingly bad when they receive a bad upbringing. Those who naturally possess the intellectual wherewithal to be philosophers, but who do not receive the right kind of education, can do far more harm than their less intellectually endowed fellows. Plato seems to have in mind here the historical Alcibiades, a beautiful, brilliant young Athenian who proved a traitor, switching sides to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Fans of the television drama Breaking Bad will not be far off the mark in taking Walter White as an example of Plato's point, since his intellectual prowess makes him far worse, morally, than his partner and former student, Jesse. Socrates' task is to describe the philosophic nature, to show what philosophers are like in contrast with non-philosophers. In Book 7, he will discuss their nurture, expanding on the program of education already spelled out in Books 2 and 3. In Book 5, the distinction between philosopher and non-philosopher rested on the distinction between knowledge and belief, which led us to the metaphysical distinction between forms and particulars. Here the focus is on the virtues that true philosophers can and do possess. Loving the truth. The most important of these virtues is love for the truth. Not only must philosophers be without falsehood, they must refuse to accept what is false, hate it, and have a love for the truth. This will strike many readers as surprising in light of Socrates' earlier insistence that the rulers will have to employ falsehood in governing, for example in rigging the lotteries determining the sacred marriages. In addressing the second wave, Socrates conceded that our rulers will have to make considerable use of falsehood and deception for the benefit of those they rule. Is Plato being inconsistent here? It may look that way at first, but on closer examination it seems not. After all, rulers can employ falsehoods even though they hate them and reluctantly use them only when something important is at stake, when the falsehood is beneficial to those it is being told to, and when it is the only or perhaps the most effective means to bringing about the benefit. And the distinction between true or genuine falsehoods and merely verbal falsehoods, which we met toward the end of Book 2, blunts the charge of inconsistency as well. While rulers will find employing verbal falsehoods useful, presumably they will never employ the radically false and soul-distorting true or genuine falsehoods. The rulers can hate what is most truly or genuinely false, but reluctantly employ mere verbal falsehoods, which are useful and so not deserving of hatred. Verbal falsehoods are like medicine, after all, and medical treatment is one of Glaucon's main examples of goods that are onerous but beneficial, not intrinsically desirable, and perhaps intrinsically undesirable, but useful. While there may be a tension in Plato's view, upon reflection it seems to fall far short of inconsistency. That this crucial philosophical virtue involves love should not be surprising, given the centrality of truth to the philosophical enterprise, and indeed that philosophy is, etymologically, the love, philion, of wisdom, Sophia. Love of truth pairs well with the role played by the guardian ruler's love for the city back in Book 3, which Socrates reminds us of here in Book 6. The rulers must be lovers of their city, Phiota lambda pi omicron lambda iota, Philopolis. We noted earlier Plato's playing up the cognitive dimension of love, focusing on the lover's belief that their beloved's flourishing is an essential part of their own flourishing. This is not to say that their love is merely cognitive, involving no feelings for the beloved or commitment to it. Perhaps Plato focuses on love's cognitive dimension because its affective dimension, how it feels, is so obvious and potent that it is likely to lead us to think of love as exclusively a matter of feeling. Plato, committed as he is to the centrality of reason in a well-lived life, wishes to remedy this by highlighting love's rational, cognitive side. Back in Book 3, Socrates claimed that the right kind of love, rho theta rho omega, ho orthos eros, has nothing mad or licentious about it and instead is the love of order and beauty that has been moderated by education. Although we tend to think of eros erotic or romantic love in terms of sexual passion, Plato argues in the Symposium that its proper object is the form of or essence of beauty. The goal of the musical education, after all, is love of the fine and beautiful. The love philosophers have and feel for the truth is sigma tau gamma epsilon iota nu, sturgeon, rather than rho omega or phi iota lambda alpha, but perhaps we should not read too much into this, as Plato does not here draw hard and fast distinctions between kinds of love as later authors are wont to do, example, between philia, eros, and agape, friendly love, erotic or romantic love, and neighborly love. But it is telling that sturgeon typically refers to parental love, which clearly involves the parents identifying their child's well-being with their own, and which involves a distinctive kind of affection. Love of truth may well be the Socratic virtue par excellence, though when we first meet Thrasymachus, he insists that Socrates is phi iota lambda tau iota mu omicron, philotomos, a lover of honor and victory rather than truth, who just wants to win arguments. This seems an ironic projection on Thrasymachus' part, since he aims to persuade his audience of a predetermined conclusion by the power of his rhetorical skill, rather than to investigate the matter and accept whatever conclusions reason leads us to. Knowing how to win arguments is the skill the sophist teaches, and it is the skill most at home in the law court. Philosophical investigation also requires skill, and we have attended to some places where logical skill is not as developed as it should be. But philosophy requires more than skill, Plato suggests. It requires the virtue of loving the truth, which in turn implies a respect for rigor well expressed by Socrates' dictum that whatever direction the argument blows us, that is where we must go. In addition to respect for rigor, another sub-virtue is open-mindedness, which we might think of as openness to rational persuasion. We noted earlier how the Republic's opening exchange raises the opposition between force and persuasion. When Polemarchus jokingly asks, "But could you persuade us, if we will not listen?" he is making the serious point that philosophical inquiry requires that we do not have a predetermined outcome, as a lawyer trying a case might, or at least that we are open to countervailing reasons and evidence. Intellectual virtues and character virtues. An interesting feature of this leading philosophical virtue is that loving the truth seems to straddle two distinct kinds of virtues, intellectual virtue and character virtue. Perhaps because he was by nature less taxonomically inclined than his student Aristotle, whose inclinations in this regard were no doubt shaped by his biological investigations, Plato does not explicitly distinguish between these kinds of virtue, as Aristotle does in his seminal work in moral philosophy, the Nicomachean Ethics. Readers will recall that a virtue is the state or condition that enables its possessor to perform its function well, where its function is its purpose or characteristic activity. A knife's function is to cut, so sharpness is its virtue, since a knife must be sharp if it is to cut well. Where character virtues such as moderation and courage enable morally correct behavior, intellectual virtues such as wisdom are traits that enable their possessors to gain knowledge. The function or goal they enable is knowledge. So genuine philosophers, Socrates tells us, must possess intellectual virtues such as quickness or ease in learning and a good memory. The absence of the latter trait allows Plato a few jokes along the way, Glaucon, in admitting that he has forgotten that they aim to make the city as a whole happy and just, thereby implicitly concedes that he lacks a philosophical nature, at least to some degree. Even Socrates himself admits that he cannot remember whose question prompted his articulating this principle. And clearly a good memory will be important to the agreement-based, question-and-answer method they have adopted to investigate the Republic's two main questions. Loving truth enables knowledge, since loving wealth or honor more than or instead of truth will hamper rather than enable learning. Thus love of truth seems, like being a quick learner or having a good memory, to be an intellectual virtue. But love of truth tells us not just about a person's intellect, but also about their character, since it tells us about what they value. Thus it seems as much a virtue of character as an intellectual virtue. The person who loves the truth can be counted on to act well and rightly when, for example, truth and self-interest conflict. Moreover, some intellectual virtues such as quickness and ease in learning are like skills insofar as they are morally neutral, depending for their moral status on the subjects learned and the end to which the knowledge gained is put. A quick learner with a good memory will master the mechanics of terrorism more quickly than a forgetful, slow learner will. Love of truth, by contrast, seems to lack this moral neutrality, as does wisdom, at least on Plato's conception of moral knowledge. If one really knows what is good, Plato has Socrates argue in the Protagoras, one would act on that knowledge if one were able to. The idea of knowing what is good or right but not acting on that knowledge, the problem of weakness of will, is not a genuine possibility. Exploring whether Plato was right about this will take us too far afield, and unsurprisingly there is much scholarly debate on the topic. But this melding of moral knowledge and moral conduct helps us see why love of truth has a foot on each side of the divide between intellectual and character virtues. Another philosophic virtue worthy of our attention is high-mindedness, mu epsilon gamma alpha lambda omicron pyro pi epsilon iota alpha, megalopropia, which is sometimes translated as magnificence. Like many of the virtues discussed in Book 6, we first met high-mindedness in Book 3, where it was implicit in the musical-poetic cultivation of courage. A decent man does not think that death is a terrible thing for someone to suffer, and thus must be told stories that will make them least afraid of death. High-mindedness is a virtue of knowing what really matters, what is worth taking seriously. Socrates suggests that a high-minded person will not consider human life to be something important, but this is best taken as a point about life's relative importance. It is not valueless, something to be thrown away on a whim, but it is not as important as the good of the city. Living is not itself an intrinsic good, though living well is. And if living well, which for Plato requires living justly, requires sacrificing one's life for the good of one's city, then the high-minded person will, ideally, have no hesitation in doing so. High-mindedness looms in the background of Plato's deepest criticisms of poetry in Book 10. Human affairs are not worth taking very seriously, Socrates insists in Book 10, and poetry is dangerously corrupting because it leads us to take our suffering seriously. Readers familiar with Stoicism will see its Socratic roots in the virtue of high-mindedness. Virtues of personal style. In addition to virtues of character and intellect, Socrates proposes another family of virtues as distinctive of the philosophical nature. Gracefulness, which we met back in Book 3 when discussing poetic meter or rhythm, is not a matter of character or intellect so much as a matter of personal, aesthetic style. Would-be philosopher kings must be graceful, epsilon chi alpha rho iota, Eucharist, and indeed they approach the divine as they absorb gracefulness from studying the forms. We meet a similar group of personal aesthetic virtues in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where traits such as wit and sociability are on Aristotle's official list of virtues, on a par with canonical, cardinal virtues such as courage and moderation. The way Plato and Aristotle treat such traits suggests that they did not draw a sharp line between character and personality, between moral and non-moral traits, as we moderns tend to do. Their attitudes toward the personal aesthetic virtues suggests a more holistic, integrated picture of human goodness on which calling someone a good person is not an exclusively moral evaluation. There is a lively scholarly debate about whether our modern notion of morality is even to be found in ancient Greek philosophical thought. At the very least, it seems safe to say that beauty and goodness are more intimately connected for Plato and Aristotle than they are for us. Proper aesthetic sensibility is the basis for morality, and the crucial notion of what is kalan fine or noble or beautiful is inescapably aesthetic. A game of checkers. It is perhaps surprising that a willingness to speak up and challenge assertions that others accept does not make Socrates' list of philosophical virtues. It is certainly an admirable trait, and one that Adeimantus displays with some frequency throughout the Republic. In Book 2, after Glaucon raises the issues he wants Socrates to address, Adeimantus insists that the most important thing, which he takes to be the hypocritical way Athenian culture praises justice, has not been said yet. Book 4 begins with Adeimantus questioning how ideal the ideal polis can be, given that the guardian ruler's austere lifestyle will leave them unhappy. And Book 5 begins with Adeimantus, prompted by Polemarchus, interrupting Socrates, immediately moving to consider the Republic's second question, when he still has questions about the way Socrates has answered the first, which prompts the three waves. Adeimantus shows that interrupting a speaker is not always rude, and he models a willingness to not be cowed by an intellectual superior. Here in Book 6, Adeimantus jumps in to answer a question Socrates has posed to Glaucon, not the first such interruption in the Republic, about whether he would be willing to entrust the city to the philosopher kings whose nature he has been describing. Adeimantus does not object to particular claims Socrates has made, he does not deny that philosophers must be courageous or quick learners, nor does he challenge the status of the personal aesthetic virtues. Instead, he offers a broader objection, suggesting that Socrates' whole procedure is unlikely to persuade anyone to entrust the city to philosophers, and to them alone. He articulates the perspective of people who are not convinced by the Socratic chain or reasoning, feeling merely outmaneuvered and not persuaded.
Just as inexperienced checkers players are trapped by the experts in the end and cannot make a move, so too they, i.e., your vanquished interlocutors, are trapped in the end and have nothing to say in this different kind of checkers, which is played not with discs but with words. Yet the truth is not affected by this outcome. I say this with a view to the present case, for someone might well say that he is unable to oppose you as you ask each of your questions, yet he sees that of all those who take up philosophy, the greatest number become cranks, not to say completely vicious, while those who seem completely decent are rendered useless to the city because of the studies you recommend.
Polemarchus, for one, knows whereof Adeimantus speaks. Socrates argued in Book 1 that defining justice as benefiting friends and harming enemies led to the conclusion that the just person is a kind of thief and justice itself is a craft of stealing. When asked if this is what he meant, Polemarchus insists, no, by God, it is not. I do not know any more what I did mean, but I still believed that to benefit one's friends and harm one's enemies is justice. There were good reasons for him to resist the conclusion Socrates has led him to, but even though he did not see what these reasons were and thus how he could resist the conclusion, Polemarchus hung on to his definition of justice, feeling outmaneuvered by Socrates rather than persuaded by him. Adeimantus is not accusing Socrates of acting in bad faith, but rather is pointing out that Socrates is perceived by many of his fellow citizens not as better at arriving at moral truth, but simply better at intellectual checkers than they are. They can and will persist in believing their seemingly refuted views, since Socrates' philosophical argumentation seems to be nothing more than a kind of game of contradiction. In short, to Socrates' question about entrusting the city to philosopher kings, the solution to the third wave Adiamantus seems to be saying, well, I might entrust the city to them, Socrates, but most people will not. Why would they, when they think of philosophers as useless at best and vicious at worst? They will nod in seeming agreement with you, but nothing you have said so far will change their minds. They think you are just playing word games. It is no accident that it is Adiamantus who in Book 2 insists twice that Socrates not merely give yet another theoretical argument that the just life is happier. Here he is doing much the same thing, asking not for a reworked version of the powers argument, but for something less abstract and more accessible. Socrates obliged Adiamantus' request in Book 2 by offering the city-soul analogy, which of course structures the rest of the Republic, and here in Book 6 he responds in a similar but even more procedurally transparent vein. The question you ask needs to be answered by means of an image or simile. So Socrates will meet Adiamantus' checkers metaphor with one of his own, meant to show why his fellow citizens regard philosophers as useless. Analogical thinking is at the heart of the Republic. Its very method is analogical, asking us to think about the nature and value of justice as a virtue of persons by first thinking about it as a virtue of city-states. Here in Book 6, Socrates explicitly appeals to similes and analogies. The Greek terms are epsilon kapanu, icon, likeness, image, reflection, from which we get the English word icon, and nu lambda omicron gamma omicron nu, analogon, proportionate to, resembling, from which we get the English word analogy. Socrates, who describes himself as greedy for images, is foregoing the longer and fuller road that leads to precise answer S, in favor of a less demanding path that offers a view of the same truths the more demanding path leads to, but the view is less clear and distinct. The road of dialectic, which requires doing without hypotheses and metaphors, is not just longer, it is a rough, steep path that only those few who are blessed with a philosophical nature are capable of following. The rest of us, most of us, given that the majority cannot be philosophic, will have to be content with an easier, less rigorous path. In the next chapter, we will explore the major metaphors of Books 6 and 7, the analogies of the sun, line, and cave. Here we will look briefly at Socrates' analogical response to Adiamantus' challenge. Given the critique of painting, poetry, and the other imitative arts that awaits us in Book 10, it is striking that here Socrates embraces the role of painter, gamero alpha phi, graphs, as he constructs his analogies. The ship of state sails the third wave. Socrates' surprising response to Adiamantus' suggestion that most people think that philosophers are useless at best and vicious at worst is that they seem to me to speak the truth. The scene will turn out to be important. Socrates does not think genuine philosophers really are useless or vicious, but he understands that people who do not distinguish the genuine philosophers from the pretenders will think they are. It is in this spirit that he offers the ship of state analogy, hoping to explain what the most decent people experience in relation to their city and why they think philosophers are useless. Think of the city as a ship, he suggests. Whom should the owner select as its captain? Obviously, the owner should select the person who possesses the art of navigation, since only a person possessing the relevant nautical skills has sufficient knowledge to chart the appropriate course to get the ship safely to its destination. But the owner, who knows nothing of navigation and is nearsighted and hard of hearing, to boot, will not choose the true captain, alas. The sailors clamor for the job, but while each of them understands his particular role on the ship and can follow the captain's orders, none of them is qualified to give such orders, despite thinking they are. This is an early instance of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias leading people to overestimate their abilities and fail to recognize their lack of competence in certain areas. The owner chooses not the person skilled in navigation, but rather the person who is clever at persuading or forcing the shipowner, with predictably bad results. And analogously, the citizens choose for their ruler not the person who possesses wisdom and knows what is best for the city as a whole, but rather someone who charms and flatters them. But why blame the philosophers and regard them as useless, Socrates seems to ask. That they are not in fact chosen for the job for which they are qualified tells us more about their fellow citizens than it does about them. Just as genuine captains do not beg shipowners for jobs or doctors do not beg the sick to be allowed to treat them, it is not for the ruler, if he is truly any use, to beg the others to accept his rule. Rulers, doctors, and captains are entitled to maintain their self-respect, which presumably entitles them to refuse to sing along to the temptations ain't too proud to beg as they go about their business. But given that what is at stake is the well-being of the city, perhaps this seemingly legitimate pride is a vice, not a virtue. We will see in Book 7 that Socrates thinks that possessing political wisdom does not in itself entail an obligation to seek to govern, only a philosopher king or queen raised by the ideal city would be under such an obligation. One might think that those who possess political wisdom should be sufficiently interested in the well-being of their city for a bit of begging to be in order. This might seem to go against Plato's dictum that it is those who are not lovers of ruling who must rule, but one can be willing to rule without loving ruling, if only to avoid the punishment of being ruled by someone worse than oneself. The historian Gordon Wood remarks that at least early in American political life, gentlemen generally stood, not ran, for election, and canvassing for an office, as Aaron Burr was said to have done for the vice presidency in 1792, was widely thought to be improper. 1 Perhaps Socrates shares something like this view, and thus regards actively seeking office as unseemly. Tending the beast. Against those genuine, wisdom-possessing philosophers are people who seem to possess wisdom but actually do not, sophists. If we think of the citizens of Athens as a huge, strong beast, these sophists have a knack for learning how best to placate the beast, how to take advantage of its moods and satisfy its appetites. But the pseudo-philosophical sophist knows nothing about which of the beast's convictions is fine or shameful, good or bad, just or unjust, but he applies all these names in accordance with how the beast reacts, calling what it enjoys good, and what angers it bad. He has no other account to give of these terms. The sophist's wisdom consists in telling the beast what it wants to hear, which echoes a point Socrates made earlier: the person who is honored and considered clever and wise in importance matters by such badly governed cities is the one who serves them most pleasantly, indulges them, flatters them, anticipates their wishes, and is clever at fulfilling them. Sophists, mere pretenders to wisdom, are adept at tending the beast, but their skill lies in persuasion, not truth-seeking. In the dialogue The Gorgias, Plato has Socrates suggest that the sophists fall short of possessing skill or craft, taukanueda, techni, and instead merely have a knack, mu pi epsilon iota rho alpha, empiria, whence the word empirical, but we can safely ignore that interesting issue here. What they possess is not wisdom, but it is not really surprising that it passes for wisdom. After all, most of us are prey to flattery, and for Socrates and Plato, the majority cannot be philosophic, hence the anti-democratic nature of the ideal polis. For Plato, it is not merely the case that most of us do not possess wisdom, but rather that most of us cannot possess it. Given his conception of knowledge, we can see why he holds this strongly anti-democratic view. Wisdom is knowledge of what is best for the city as a whole, and to possess such knowledge one must grasp the form of the good. Only someone with this stable, true model of goodness will be able to establish here on earth conventions of what is fine or just or good. Readers who do not share Socrates' austere conception of knowledge will likely think that genuine wisdom, while still rare and very different from the focus group politicking of modern sophists, is more common than Socrates allows. Shelter from the storm. Suppose that Socrates is right that no one can be happy in a polis not governed by philosophers. Given the madness of the majority and the fact that hardly anyone acts sanely in public affairs, a person trying to live well, which requires living justly, is like a man who has fallen among wild animals and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice nor sufficiently strong to oppose the general savagery alone. What should such a person do? I suspect that many readers will be disappointed by Socrates' answer. For rather than urging political engagement to reform and improve a polis that falls short of their ideals of justice, or advocating revolution to overthrow a polis that is not merely non-just but is positively unjust, Socrates instead counsels withdrawal from public affairs, urging those who want to live justly in unjust city-states to lead a quiet life and do their own work, like someone who takes refuge under a little wall from a storm, and is satisfied if he can somehow lead his present life free from injustice and impious acts and depart from it with good hope, blameless and content. Many politically inclined readers will reject this approach, seeing it as acquiescent to injustice, but the fair-minded among them should be able to appreciate why some will find it attractive. While Socrates' preferred path seems apolitical, its defenders might reply that he is actually offering a different kind of politics, one that is interior rather than exterior, keep the constitution of the ideal city firmly in mind and make oneself its citizen. As with the virtue of high-mindedness discussed earlier, we can see here the seeds of the Stoic idea of cosmopolitanism. One is not primarily a citizen of the city-state one inhabits in space and time, but rather a universal polis. And surely high-mindedness is at work as one seeks shelter from the storm. If indeed human affairs are not worth taking very seriously, why not tend to one's inner polis rather than muck about in the outer one, especially since that outer polis will be genuinely habitable only by a remarkable stroke of luck or by divine intervention.
No city, constitution, or individual man will ever become perfect until either some chance event compels those few philosophers who are not vicious, the ones who are now called useless, to take charge of a city, whether they want to or not, and compels the city to obey them, or until a god inspires the present rulers and kings or their offspring with a true erotic love for true philosophy.
Many readers will share Socrates' pessimism about the likelihood that the or an ideal polis can be realized in the actual world, but many will be troubled at his seeming to reject political action as well as what seems to be his focus on the ideal world rather than the admittedly imperfect actual world. Looking at how Socrates himself lived in Athens, a polis that fell far short of the ideal that Plato sketches in the Republic, might be instructive here. Did Socrates follow his own advice? He did not pack up and leave, even after being convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth in a trial that, however procedurally fair it was, yielded what seems a substantively unjust verdict. He refuses to leave, because the best arguments lead him to conclude that leaving would be unjust. Socrates did not lead a quiet life. If he had, it is unlikely that we would ever have heard of him or that Athens would have treated him as it did. But he did his own work, as he conceived of it. His God-given work, he tells us in the Apology, was to be a gadfly, questioning and exhorting Athenians to virtue. In his final words to the jurors, he asks them to do for his sons what he tried to do for them, to correct them if they seem to care about riches, or anything more than about virtue. So it seems that Socrates did not live the quiet life he counsels. But when the so-called 30 tyrants, installed by Sparta to govern Athens after the end of the Peloponnesian War, demanded that Socrates bring them Leon of Salamis for execution, he refused, regarding the act as unjust and impious. So his eschewing politics did not entail complicity in injustice or collaboration with the unjust. Alas, though, he did not try to prevent others from doing so, nor did he try to warn Leon. While the others went to Salamis to fetch Leon, Socrates went quietly home. Chapter 10. Metaphors to think by. The sun and divided line analogies. The analogies we looked at in the last chapter are interesting, but they are merely appetizers to the metaphorical feast Socrates soon serves, which features the sun, line, and cave analogies, the last of which we will cover in the next chapter. It is philosophical fare of the highest order, since the topic is the most important subject, which is even more important than justice and the other virtues. The form of goodness itself, the form of the good, is the most important thing to learn about. Since it is by their relation to it that just things and the others become useful and beneficial. But we have no adequate knowledge of it. The Greek rendered by the form of the good is tau omicron gamma alpha theta omicron delta alpha, he tu aga tu idea, literally, the idea of the good. As noted earlier, for Plato delta alpha is not an idea in our ordinary sense, but rather something that is not only mind-independently real but is actually more real than the many particular instances of it. The metaphysical elevator goes all the way up to level 4, though here Plato implies that there is yet another floor, where a very special form, the form of the good, resides. To get a sense of the importance of the form of the good, consider first the distinctive virtue of the philosopher rulers, political wisdom. Political wisdom is knowledge of what is best for the city, but one cannot know what is superlatively good for the city without understanding what goodness itself is. I do not suppose that just in fine things will have acquired much of a guardian in someone who does not even know in what way they are good. And I divine that no one will have adequate knowledge of them until he knows this. Although one can believe that something is good without grasping why it is, one cannot know that something is good without knowing why that thing is good, and one cannot know this, Socrates thinks, without knowing what goodness itself is. A ruler who does not understand what goodness itself is will at best have true beliefs about what is good for the city, but that falls far short of the knowledge required for genuine wisdom. So what is the form of the good, goodness itself? What the good is not. Socrates does not claim to know what the good is, but he does think he knows what it is not. Narrowing the field by excluding unworkable options is a kind of intellectual progress, and so he begins with two untenable accounts of the nature of the good. The first view, held by the majority, is the view that pleasure is the good. This is hedonism, the view that pleasure is the only thing that is good in itself. Any other thing that is good extrinsically, by being a means to the one intrinsically good thing, pleasure. Although they often run in the same harness, hedonism is distinct from egoism, the view that one's interests count for more than the interests of others, perhaps because others' interests do not count at all. Classical utilitarians such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were hedonists but not egoists. They regarded total net pleasure, the result of subtracting the pain an action produces from the pleasure it produces, as the standard of right action, where the interests of all parties affected by the action are given equal weight. Socrates immediately locates a problem for hedonism. There are bad pleasures, which even hedonism's advocates will concede. Although he does not give any examples, they are not hard to come by. Imagine a peeping Tom who is very careful not to be seen. He derives a great deal of pleasure from spying on his neighbors through his high-powered, and well-hidden, telescope, and they are none wiser, so there is no pain he is inflicting to offset the pleasure he produces for himself. But his action still seems wrong, and his pleasure is an evil pleasure, as almost anyone would think. Even though philosophical questions are not best settled by majority vote, anyone who concedes that the peeping Tom's pleasure is bad should reject hedonism, for how can pleasure be what is good in itself if there are pleasures that are bad in themselves? The second view Socrates considers has a bit more going for it than hedonism. If nothing else, it is held by more sophisticated folks. It is the view that the good, is knowledge, which we might awkwardly dub epistemicism, from the Greek word for knowledge, episteme. This seems like a view that Socrates would find attractive, given the centrality of knowledge to philosophy, but he quickly dismisses it not, as with hedonism, because there are instances of bad knowledge, though presumably there are, but because epistemicism leads to an infinite regress, or, more properly, an infinite progress. Knowledge always has an object, he reminds Glaucon. If I have knowledge of or about something, there is no such thing as mere, objectless knowledge. The various crafts are similar in being knowledge of how to do certain things, but they are distinguished by their objects. Farmers know how to farm, doctors know how to heal, etc. Similarly, the grammarian and mathematician both possess the same kind of knowledge, theoretical or propositional knowledge that certain propositions are true, as opposed to knowledge of how to do things, but they too are distinguished by their objects. If we ask the sophisticates who hold that the good is knowledge what that knowledge's object is, they will reply, Socrates thinks, that it is knowledge of the good. This is highly problematic, and not just because it is circular. If the good is identical to knowledge, then for every occurrence of the good we can substitute knowledge, just as we can substitute 2 plus 1 for any instance of 3 in a mathematical formula. Example, since 32 is equal to 9, it follows that 2 plus 1 for 2 is equal to 9. But if the knowledge in question is knowledge of the good, then the epistemicist's core claim, the good equals knowledge, becomes, the good equals knowledge of the good. But by substituting knowledge of the good for the good, generates, the good equals knowledge of the good, which in turn generates, the good equals knowledge of the good, and so on, with no end in sight. Clearly, Socrates thinks knowledge is good. But it is a good, not the good. It is one of philosophy's distinctive goods, but knowledge is not the good, it is not what goodness is. But even if we do not know what the good is, Socrates thinks we know two things it is not, and that is at least a start. So what does Socrates think the good is? The analogy of the sun. Socrates does not answer this question directly, but not because he is being cagey, as Thrasymachus might suggest. And not, at least not explicitly, because he thinks the good cannot be defined in any non-circular way. The 18th century philosopher Joseph Butler remarked that everything is what it is, and not another thing, which the 20th century philosopher G. E. Moore quoted at the outset of his Principia Ethica before arguing that any attempt to give a real definition of goodness was doomed to fail. Cinema lovers may recall a memorable exchange in the film The Deer Hunter between Mike, Robert De Niro, and Stanley, John Cazale, in which Mike, holding up a bullet, says, "Stanley, see this? This is this. This ain't something else. This is this point." One Stanley does not understand the lesson, but I suspect Socrates, Butler, and Moore would all be sympathetic to Mike's point, since the good is what it is and not some other thing. So why does Socrates not provide a value for x in the philosophical equation, the good equals x? Why does he choose to abandon the quest for what the good itself is for the time being? Although antagonists like Thrasymachus will scoff, I believe it is because Socrates possesses the virtue of epistemic humility. He claims not to know what the good is and insists that one should not talk about things one does not know as if one does know them, which is what he'd be doing if he responded directly to Adiamantus' request for an account of the good. But while he cannot say what the good is, he thinks he can say something about what it is like, which brings us to the sun analogy. In Book 7, Socrates will suggest that dialectic rigorous, forms-based philosophical reflection is the only avenue to genuine knowledge. As he did earlier in Book 6, he reminds Glaucon and company that they will be avoiding this longer road and proceeding in a less exact, hypothetical way which will give them a sense of what the good is, but which will fall well short of full-blown philosophical knowledge of it. Socrates' plan is to explain the form of the good in terms of something more readily understandable, the sun. He suggests that the good, the form or essence of goodness itself, plays the same role in the intelligible realm that the sun plays in the visible realm. Strictly speaking, the focus is the sun's role in the sensible realm, the world of sense experience, but we will follow Socrates in using visible to designate this realm, which also includes what he can hear, touch, taste, and smell as well as what we can see. While he cannot say what the good is, he can say what he thinks the good does. His idea is that the sun, the visible world, the good, the intelligible world, the roles the sun and the good play in their respective worlds are analogous. In the visible world, the sun by its light enables us to see the many particular things and also enables their existence. In the intelligible world, the good by its truth enables us to know the forms and also enables the existence of the forms. Seeing something requires both a visible object and the power of sight. But it also requires a third kind of thing, light. Without light to illuminate the object, the power of sight will not reveal that object to us. The sun is the main and most obvious source of light, so the sun enables us see visible objects. But it does more than enable their being seen, Socrates thinks, it enables their very existence. This is certainly true of living things, which depend for their existence on the light of the sun. It is less clear that this is true of rocks, but we need not be sticklers about this. The same goes for the form of the good.
What gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, but their being is also due to it.
So, just as the sun provides the light that enables us to see visible objects, the form of the good provides the truth that enables us to know intelligible objects, which of course are the forms. The many beautiful things in the rest are visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible. Beautiful things owe not only their being seen but also their very existence to the sun. Similarly, the form of beauty depends for both its knowability and its very existence on the form of the good. Thus the form of the good plays a foundational role in Plato's epistemology, since it is the condition of all knowledge, and also in his metaphysics, since it is the condition of the existence of the other forms, and in turn the existence of concrete particular objects. Particular beautiful things are beautiful because they partake, if only temporarily, in the form of beauty. They are temporary, spatio-temporal images or copies of the form of beauty itself. Similarly, a particular just action or soul is just because it participates in the form of justice, and so on. And since beautiful things and just actions are good and useful, they must also participate in the form of the good. It is by their relation to the form of the good that just things and the others become useful and beneficial. Thus the form of the good subsumes the forms of justice, wisdom, courage, etc. Not only would they not be good without it, they would not exist without it. So goodness is at the core of Plato's conception of the universe, both epistemologically and metaphysically. The divided line. Socrates follows the sun analogy with a linear perspective on how the visible and intelligible worlds differ. His focus here is largely epistemological, though as we might expect, metaphysics looms in the background. Having already said a bit about how knowledge and belief differ, here Plato goes into more detail, saying more about their distinct objects, thus drawing on the ill-fated powers argument, and also making distinctions between different kinds of knowledge and belief. We can think of the line as a sort of epistemological companion to the metaphysical elevator, in which one ascends epistemologically from belief to knowledge and metaphysically from concrete particular objects to the form of the good. Start a line segment and divide it unevenly, as below, into two subsegments. Let one segment represent the visible world and the other the intelligible world. Belief is the epistemic state, or, as Socrates would have it, the power that operates in the visible world, while knowledge governs the intelligible world. Since length corresponds to relative clarity and opacity, the line segment representing the intelligible realm will be longer than the segment representing the visible realm. This should make sense, given Plato's view that the forms, which are at home in the intelligible realm, are both more real than the particulars and are epistemically clearer. The forms are objects of knowledge, while the particulars are objects of belief. Belief, while clearer than ignorance, is darker and opaquer than knowledge, as Socrates claimed earlier. So, even though there are more objects in the visible world than in the intelligible world, since the relation between particulars and their forms is a relation of many to one, the segment representing the intelligible realm is longer than the segment representing the visible realm. Now here comes a slightly tricky part: divide each subsegment again by the same ratio as the entire line was divided. So now the visible world comprises subsegments A and B, and the intelligible world comprises C and D, and with the ratios of both A to B and C to D identical to the original ratio of visible to intelligible. An obvious consequence of this is that A, B, C, D. A less obvious consequence, which Socrates either does not notice or notices but does not mention, is that B and C turn out to be the same length. Given that the line is arranged in terms of relative clarity and opacity, 6.509d, the equality of B and C suggests an epistemic and metaphysical parity between the hard-to-see Socrates endorsing such a view. This is at least a wrinkle in the divided line analogy, but let us assume that it is a wrinkle that can be ironed out and move on. Now we will see the parallel between metaphysics and epistemology. Plato further divides the main epistemic states or powers, belief and knowledge, which appear on the line's right side in Figure 3. The two bottom subsegments of the line, A and B, which together make up the visible realm, have different objects. The lowest level, A, has images, icons, for its objects, shadows and reflections, and, presumably, the analogies and metaphors of the sort that Socrates is so greedy for in Book 6, as well as the paintings, sculptures, and poems that he will criticize in Book 10. The second lowest level, B, comprises the original items of which those images are copies. The bed in which Van Gogh slept in his room at Arles, which served as the model for his famous paintings of it, would be an object appropriate to B, while the paintings of the bed, being copies of that spatio-temporal object, belong in A. In addition, we might think the second-hand opinions that many of us have, opinions we merely parrot from our favorite news source, belong here in A. Many readers active on Facebook or Twitter will be familiar with someone whose social media mission seems to be reposting or retweeting stories and memes that express the views they have gotten from others. When someone says, "I have thought about this a lot," one hopes they mean this literally, where thought is a verb, and they have scrutinized and analyzed and seen implications of the point in question. What we are often saying, alas, is I have a thought about this, and I think that thought a lot, where thought is a noun, and thinking that thought does not require critical examination of the idea's merits and demerits, etc. In addition to their different objects, A and B also differ in terms of the epistemic or cognitive states operating in them. While Plato generally talks of belief, delta xi alpha, doxa, as operating in the visible realm, here he distinguishes between epsilon kappa alpha sigma alpha, ikasia, imagining, or merely imaging, and pi sigma tau iota, pistis, which is translatable as belief, but which suggests credence, trust, and sincerity as well. The intelligible realm is where the forms live. While the subsegments of visible had different kinds of objects, here the objects are the same, forms, although the form of the good operates in D, the highest level. Segments C and D thought, delta iota nu omicron iota alpha, dianoia, and understanding, nu eta sigma iota, noesis, respectively are distinguished by how knowers are related to the forms that populate the intelligible world. Hypotheses and first principles in the divided line. A crucial difference between thought, C, and understanding, D, is the role that hypothesis, pi theta epsilon sigma iota, hypothesis, literally, what is placed or set under something, plays. Mathematicians, who occupy themselves in thought, employ hypotheses in their thinking. They hypothesize the odd and the even, the various figures, the three kinds of angles, etc. But, Socrates thinks, they do not think it is necessary to give any account, lambda gamma omicron, logos, of them, presumably because these hypotheses seem so obviously true that no justification is needed. Just as mathematicians take it for granted that there are numbers and triangles, physicists assume the existence of an external world of spatio-temporal objects, whose properties and behavior they study without feeling the need to justify this assumption. They treat their hypotheses as first principles, rokai, archi, as foundations and draw conclusions from them. The mathematicians' conclusions are not about the particular triangle or circle drawn on the blackboard, the physicists are not about the particular electrons in this particular cloud chamber, rather, they are about triangles and circles in themselves, or about electrons in themselves. Both try to prove things about the forms, on the model of inquiry depicted by the divided line. By contrast, the philosopher, who roams the realm of understanding, recognizes hypotheses as hypotheses. They do not think of their hypotheses and assumptions as self-evidently true first principles requiring no justification. Unlike their mathematical and scientific cousins, the philosopher does not treat a hypothesis as an unassailable foundation or first principle but rather as something that stands in need of a logos, a justification or rationale. The hardest part of philosophy, Socrates says, has to do with giving a rational account. It is not that mathematicians and scientists are too lazy to justify their hypotheses, but rather that they do not feel the need to do so, since their assumption seems so obviously true. But so long as the foundational hypothesis is unaccounted for, what follows cannot fully count as knowledge. On Socrates' view, even though it involves grasping mathematical forms, what mechanism could possibly turn any agreement into knowledge when it begins with something unknown and puts together the conclusion and steps in between from what is unknown? Socrates implies here that mathematicians can give valid arguments whose conclusions must be true if their premises are true, but that the conclusions of their arguments are merely conditionally and not absolutely true. That is a far cry from giving an argument whose conclusion must be true, period, which would require showing that the hypotheses in question are true and do not merely seem to be true. While the mathematician's valid arguments might be sound, the mathematician is never in a position to know whether their arguments are sound or not until they justify the hypothesis that on which the conclusion ultimately rests. To get a sense of what is at stake, consider a hypothesis that many readers encountered in high school geometry class, Euclid's parallel postulate. That parallel lines extended indefinitely in space will never meet seems so intuitively obvious as to be axiomatic. No wonder geometers do not try to give an account of this hypothesis. Doing so seems a waste of time, and developing a geometry that rejects that postulate seems a fool's errand. But, as many readers know, the geometry required for Einstein's general theory of relativity is non-Euclidean, geometry that rejects the parallel postulate. Space, on Einstein's view, is curved, so Euclidean geometry misdescribes it. The assumption that parallel lines indefinitely extended in space would never touch seemed too obvious to need a justification, but it turns out to be false. That is the kind of worry Socrates has about the realm of thought. Dialectic and understanding. It is not that hypotheses are dispensed within the realm of understanding. Instead, they are treated as hypotheses, as needing justification, rather than as first principles requiring no justification.
It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles but truly as hypotheses stepping stones to take off from, enabling it to reach the unhypothetical first principle of everything. Having grasped this principle, it reverses itself, and, keeping hold of what follows from it, comes down to conclusion without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms, and ending in forms.
Understanding is the result of what Socrates calls dialectic, that is what the initial it in the quotation just above refers to. Dialectic is the longer, harder road that Socrates chooses not to travel in the Republic, opting instead for a discussion relying on analogies and metaphors. Dialectic is like mathematical thinking in having the forms for its objects, but, as we just noted, dialectic treats hypotheses and assumptions differently than mathematical thinking. Here are some of dialectic's distinctive features, which ground ways in which understanding differs from thought. 1. Giving an account. The dialectician, i.e., the genuine philosopher, is able to give an account of the being of each thing. In addition to being able to grasp the essence of the thing under discussion, the philosopher is also able to explain that essence, to give an account of it. Someone who is able to give an account of the being of each thing is dialectical, Socrates says. But insofar as he is unable to give an account of something, either to himself or to another, he has no understanding of it. Book 5's lovers of sights and sounds may have many true beliefs about which objects are beautiful, but being unable to grasp the form of beauty, they are unable to explain why a beautiful thing is beautiful, and thus lack knowledge. Similarly, the geometer who assumes that the parallel postulate is true but who is unable to justify that assumption lacks understanding. They think with concepts they do not fully understand. 2. Integrated knowledge. Presumably, the mathematician is able to give an account of the various mathematical objects she concerns herself with. But the dialectician is also able to see connections between the individual forms. She sees their association and relationship with one another and so achieves a unified intellectual vision. Anyone who can achieve a unified vision is dialectical, Socrates says, and anyone who cannot is not. A geometer is probably able to achieve a unified grasp of the various geometric forms. It is hard to imagine someone specializing in, say, rectangles who knows nothing about circles or spheres or trapezoids. But the philosopher, the dialectician, is able to unify different domains of study, understanding not just geometry and physics or game theory and biology in themselves, but grasping how these disciplines and the forms they study are interrelated. In short, the philosopher sees and makes connections between disparate domains. 3. Purely formal reasoning. Thought relies on visual aids. The geometer's object in trying to prove a theorem about the nature of triangles is the form of triangularity, but they draw particular triangles on particular chalkboards as an aid for grasping the triangle's essence. Those drawings are aids borrowed from the visible realm. Understanding, by contrast, proceeds without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms, and ending in forms. The dialectician is able to think with the forms alone. Her seeing is purely intellectual, and does not involve any objects from the visible realm at all, or the kinds of metaphors Socrates employs to make sense of the form of the good. Dialectic tries through argument and apart from all sense perceptions to find the being of things and does not give up until he grasps the good itself with understanding itself. 4. The form of the good. Perhaps dialectic's most distinctive feature, and thus the most important difference between understanding and thought, is that dialectic involves seeing how the various forms are related to the form of the good. Thus dialectic requires the most complete kind of intellectual integration possible. This integration is both horizontal, so to speak, understanding how forms are related to each other, and also vertical, understanding how these forms are related to the form of the good, which, as the condition of both the knowability and existence of the forms, is at a level higher than them level 5, so to speak, on Plato's metaphysical elevator. Plato's universe is fundamentally ordained toward the good. The form of the good is the unhypothetical first principle of everything, and one does not fully grasp a thing's essence until one grasps the end it aims at, as well. Dialectical understanding is thus a very tall order. 5. Foundationalism. The contemporary epistemological distinction between foundationalism and coherentism sheds light on the difference between thought and understanding. Even though Plato does not think of knowledge as justified true belief, his concern with giving an account implies that a discussion of justification is not completely out of order. A coherentist holds that a belief's being justified is a matter of its being properly related to other beliefs. One's beliefs hang together in a coherent way, with minimal inconsistency between beliefs. Presumably some inconsistency has to be allowed, otherwise no one's beliefs would be justified, since we all unknowingly have beliefs that are at odds with each other. The foundationalist, by contrast, thinks that at least one belief must be justified in a non-inferential way, not getting its justification from another belief. Such a belief is the foundation, the archie of the justification of all other beliefs. The realm of thought is coherentist. The mathematicians' conclusions are in full agreement with the hypotheses they treat as first principles. The realm of understanding, by contrast, is foundationalist. It rests ultimately on the form of the good, which is the source of the intelligibility, and indeed the existence, of the other forms. Ironically, the procedure for determining whether one grasps this foundation seems itself coherentist, unless someone can distinguish in an account the form of the good from everything else, can survive all refutation, as if in a battle, and can come through all of this with his account still intact, you'll say that he does not know the good itself. We have witnessed this procedure, Elenchus, throughout the Republic, starting with Cephalus and Polemarchus and Thrasymachus' accounts of justice. We saw it most recently in the two accounts of the good that Socrates rejected earlier in Book 6. Socrates seems to suggest that what makes an account of X true is that it can survive the sort of cross-examination we have seen so far in the Republic. But his actual view, I think, is not that coherence constitutes the correctness of an account, but rather that coherence is the best criterion of correctness. An account is not made true by its having no internal inconsistencies and no false implications or entailments. Instead, its consistency and coherence are good evidence and perhaps the best evidence that it is true. Readers familiar with Plato's Euthyphro will find there a helpful example of this distinction between constitution and criterion. One of the Euthyphro's main questions is whether the gods love holiness because it is holy or whether holiness is holy because the gods love it. That is, do the gods loving X make X holy or constitute X's holiness, so X's holiness is due to the external fact that the gods love it rather than some of its internal features? Or is the gods loving X simply good evidence that X is holy, their love for X being a criterion of X's being holy, but not what constitutes X's holiness? In short, is X loved because it is holy, or holy because it is loved? That an account of the good or any important concept is maximally coherent suggests that it is correct, but coherence is criterial rather than constitutive of its being true. What makes an account true is its connection to the form of the good. Socrates' hypothetical method. Before moving on, we should note how transparent Socrates has been in employing hypotheses in the Republic, reminding Glaucon and company of the conditional nature of any conclusions they draw from their hypotheses. For example, when offering the opposition principle as the basis for dividing the soul, he remarks, "Let us hypothesize, pi omicron theta mu epsilon nu omicron iota, hypothemenai, that this is correct and carry on." But if we agree that it should ever be shown to be incorrect, all the consequences we have drawn from it will also be lost. Socrates is reminding us that by employing hypotheses and analogies we are traveling on a less rigorous path, one that will give us a sense of what the good is but will not let us look on it directly. This should make sense, for even if Socrates is a genuine philosopher king, though he claims otherwise, the rest of us Glaucon, Polemarchus, you, me are not, and we would be blinded by trying to look directly at the good, just as we would be blinded if we looked directly at the sun. So Socrates opts for the hypothetical, analogical method, which allows us to think about the good without understanding it. For that, dialectic is needed. Dialectic, it's no game. Socrates appeals to dialectic to distinguish genuine from counterfeit philosophers, as his response to the third wave requires of him. It also enriches his explanation of the negative view of philosophers so many Athenians have. The trouble is that a great evil comes from dialectic as it is currently practiced, since the young people who practice it imitate Socrates' method of intellectual cross-examination but misuse it by treating it as a kind of game of contradiction. A genuine philosopher, who loves and reveres the truth, regards dialectic as the best means of getting at the truth and employs it in that spirit. But without reverence for the truth, dialectic becomes merely a game aimed at humiliating the bloviating pretender to knowledge and thus showing how clever its practitioner is. It is no wonder, then, that his fellow citizens regard Socrates as a bad influence on the young people who flock to him. Unsurprisingly, Socrates employs yet another metaphor to address the dangers of dialectic when it is not practiced with the love of truth. Imagine a bright young person brought up surrounded by much wealth and many flatterers, who finds out, when he has become a man, that he is not the child of his professed parents and that he cannot discover his real ones. This turns the young person's world upside down. Core beliefs about who they are turn out to be false. They regard their adoptive parents as liars and no longer live as they were raised to do. This is what it is like to be a young person whose core moral beliefs are challenged. A person who is properly raised will, like Glaucon and Adeimantus, believe that the just life is happier, that they ought to be motivated by what is fine and noble rather than by narrow self-interest, but they do not know why the just life is happier or what the fine and noble really is. Dialectic as practiced by counterfeit philosophers shakes him from his convictions and makes him believe that the fine is no more fine than shameful, and the same with the just, the good, and the things he honored most. It induces a kind of intellectual and moral vertigo. Values and ways of life that seemed so certain now seem flimsy and evanescent. Improperly deployed, dialectic turns young people into relativists or nihilists who think of traditional moral virtues such as justice as shams in much the same way Thrasymachus did back in Book 1, as tools clever people use to dupe simpletons like the unknowing orphan until the scales fall from their eyes. That so many of Plato's dialogues end without discovering the nature of the virtue in question, that is, in aporia, difficulty or befuddlement, probably does not help either. Rather than thinking that eliminating wrong accounts is a kind of progress, the clever game player thinks he has shown that there is no answer. Socrates thinks that few young people are sufficiently orderly and steady by nature to practice dialectic properly. Instead of being willing to engage in discussion in order to look for the truth, the bright young person plays at contradiction for sport. They will imitate and thus internalize the wrong models, which echoes the concern Socrates raised when discussing how and why the storytellers needed to be supervised. Thus in the advanced education for would-be philosopher queens and kings that we will look at after discussing the cave analogy, students are not trained in dialectic until they reach the age of 30. So dialectic is no game. It is dangerous if practiced without a love of truth, capable of doing real damage to both its practitioner and its victims. But it also promises great cognitive benefit, as it is the genuine philosopher's tool par excellence, a tool enabling full understanding. This understanding goes far beyond the kind of understanding Socrates' analogies can yield, which Glaucon claims at the close of Book 6. He understands, mu alpha nu theta nu omega, understanding, nu eta sigma iota, but he does not understand it.